Think your job is bad medieval folks got paid to breathe poison, eat sins and shovel royal poop literally. Welcome to the job fair from hell. And guess what? You're next in line. So you think your job sucks. You've got deadlines, Karen, from accounting and that weird microwave smell in the break room. But at least your office isn't a leaky wooden hut infested with plague rats, and your boss doesn't pay you in turnips and beatings. Welcome to the worst job fair in history, a place where every position comes with a very real risk of dying. And not just dying horribly slowly and covered in something foul-smelling. Let's get this straight, the Middle Ages were not some romantic Game of Thrones cosplay with knights and wenches and candlelit banquets. They were dirty, diseased, and deeply unfair. The jobs worse. Imagine waking up at 4 a.m. every day to wade into human excrement, knowing full well that if it doesn't kill you, the rats might. That was just Monday. If you were a medieval worker, you didn't have a career path, you had a career plague. Occupational safety laws, OSHA, didn't exist. The only regulation was try not to bleed on the Lord's floor. If your job injured you, which it almost certainly would, you were most likely to get a prayer than a bandage. And don't think you could just quit. Most people didn't choose their profession. You were born into it. Dad shovels dung congrats, you're next in line. It's less of a resume and more of a hereditary curse. There was no quiet quitting, just loud dying. We'll be diving into the blood-soaked, piss-soaked, occasionally beer-soaked labour force of the Middle Ages. From the guy who scraped poop out of castle toilets to the woman who brewed beer until the church decided she was a witch, every single job was a game of how badly can this kill me. And trust me, the competition was fierce. But before we start dragging you job by job through this delightful sewer of history, let's address the myth. The myth that they didn't know any better. Oh, they knew. They definitely knew it was disgusting, painful, and deadly. They just didn't have a choice. You either did the job or starved, or got drafted, or got accused of sorcery and drowned. So you know options. You might be imagining peasants skipping around in fields, occasionally wiping sweat from their brow as they harvest golden wheat in the sunset. That's adorable. In reality, they were gnawing on stale bread with their one remaining tooth, praying their open wound wouldn't attract flies carrying God knows what, which it did. What's wild is that half of these jobs were essential to society. Want clean clothes? Someone had to soak them in urine first. Want a decent meal? Someone had to butcher a diseased pig with a dull knife and no refrigeration. Want to not die in a ditch. Someone had to ring the church bell to warn you of Viking raids and hope it didn't crush their spine in the process. This wasn't career fulfillment. This was survival roulette. Spin the wheel. Maybe today you collapse in a mine. Maybe you get kicked in the chest by a mule. Maybe your lungs fill with cowhide fumes. Either way, you die younger than your dog does today. Modern jobs might fry your brain, but at least they don't boil your skin. Ever heard of tanners? They worked in open vats of animal guts and ammonia. It made their skin peel and their neighbours gag. That's not a metaphor, that's a Tuesday. So why do we start here at the job fair? Because this is where it all begins. The illusion of medieval society functioning like some quaint clockwork system. Gone. The truth. It was duct tape, urine, and desperation. The social contract wasn't work hard and succeed. It was work hard and maybe don't die today. And the worst part, people aspired to this. If you weren't born a noble or a priest, you basically had two dreams: survive long enough to maybe own a goat or die, and hope someone buries you deep enough to avoid being dug up by dogs. Career goals, baby. Let's not even get started on how women were treated in the labour force. Actually, scratch that, we will get started very soon. But spoiler alert, it involves beer, paranoia, and firewood. Lots of firewood. So much firewood it became a job category. Look, if this feels like a roast of medieval society, It is. But it's also a weird kind of tribute. These people were tough. Really tough. Not CrossFit tough I haven't eaten in 3 days, but still have to drag dead animals through a swamp tough. So as much as we laugh, and oh we will laugh, let's also nod to their sheer ability to endure. Because trust me, by the time we reach the end of this story, you'll be looking at your ergonomic office chair and thinking, wow, this is practically a throne. You'll whisper thank yous to plumbing antibiotics unions and anyone who decided that maybe we shouldn't soak wool in pee anymore. So grab a drink, maybe not a medieval one, and settle in. We're about to meet some of history's hardest working, most ill-fated and least appreciated employees. And don't worry, we saved the grossest jobs for dessert. Think your Monday morning meeting is soul-crushing. Just wait till you hear about the guy whose job was literally chief blood drainer. Let's begin with Exhibitor the Rat Catcher. You know that one co-worker who's always sick, coughing into your coffee and swearing it's just allergies. Now imagine your co-worker is a rat. And not just any rat, one carrying microscopic death in its fleas, squeaking its way through medieval alleys, dragging the Black Plague behind it like a tiny twitchy Grim Reaper. Welcome to the life of a medieval rat catcher, the brave, the desperate, the doomed. These weren't exterminators in hazmat suits. These were guys with burlap sacks, wooden sticks, and a casual attitude toward rabies. No gloves, no masks, no training, just raw enthusiasm and an iron stomach. Sometimes they'd bring a scruffy dog or a ferret to help, because when your opponent is plague-ridden vermin, it's only fair to bring another species into the battle. Rat catchers had one job: hunt rats before the rats hunted you. They'd crawl through sewers, sneak into homes, and dig through trash piles so foul they could knock a horse unconscious. They didn't do it for glory. They did it because someone had to. Because when rats ran free, people dropped like flies. And medieval flies also probably carried plague just for bonus points. There's something poetic about being paid a few pennies to save an entire city from collapse, while also being treated like human garbage. The rich wouldn't touch you, the poor wouldn't invite you in. But when the rats came knocking, guess who got the panicked midnight summons? Oi, Harold, there's something screaming in my walls and I think it bit the cat. And let's talk about the risks. These weren't Disney rats. These were sewer-dwelling, corpse-chewing nightmares with claws. A bite could mean tetanus, gangrene, or you guessed it, the plague. All that for a job that paid less than a cobbler's apprentice, and definitely didn't come with dental. Most of these guys didn't live long enough to spend what little they earned. Now here's the kicker, these rat catchers weren't even always respected when they were right. Some towns actually banned them because they believed rat catchers attracted rats, like the medieval version of don't talk about sharks or they'll show up. So instead of funding public health, towns just told the rat guys to leave, to avoid bad vibes. The irony. A few of these rat catchers actually understood more about disease than the doctors wearing perfume-filled bird masks. They noticed patterns dead rats meant sick people soon followed. But nobody listened because science hadn't been invented yet. The local priest just said it were punishment from God and suggested everyone whip themselves in the street. Problem solved. But let's not romanticize them too much. Some of these guys kept the rats alive, in cages, as proof of their work or worse, as backup supply for towns that needed more convincing to pay them. One man's pest control is another man's entrepreneurial nightmare. Imagine walking into a medieval inn and seeing a guy with 36 writhing rats tied to his belt like furry keychains. Even the equipment was laughable. They'd use homemade traps made of wire and wood, or just whack rats with clubs like a plague-themed version of Whack-A-Mole. Some wore leather boots pulled up to their thighs, not for style, but because rats like to bite legs. Others just prayed and hoped their tetanus wasn't that bad this time. Of course, we can't forget the children. Yes, children were sometimes enlisted as mini rat catchers. Why, they were small, cheap and expendable. Timmy crawl under that pile of trash and grab the hissing noise. Child labour laws, not a thing. Childhood itself barely existed, just a short prelude to hard labour and preventable death. So what did success look like for a rat catcher? Let's say you single-handedly cleared the castle's kitchens. Yay! You get a pat on the back and maybe a crust of bread. More likely you're told to burn your clothes and sleep in the stable. After all, nobody wants plague germs on the pewterware. Social ladder status slightly above the gong, farmer slightly below the guy who rings the leper bell. Want to know the true horror rat catchers could still be blamed if people died anyway. The rats are gone, but my cousin's got buboes. Must have been the catcher's fault, because medieval logic was a beautiful mess of superstition, misplaced blame, and a deep-seated fear of anything with more than 4 legs. There are even records of rat catchers being accused of witchcraft when plagues got worse. Apparently dragging sacks full of rodents around town looked a little too shady for some. So congratulations, do your job too well and you get burned alive. Do it badly and you still get blamed. Either way, someone's lighting a torch. Let's compare this to today, shall we? Modern pest control workers have vans, traps, poison, protective gear and Google reviews. If they find a mouse, it's a minor inconvenience. In medieval times, one rat could spell a neighbourhood-wide funeral. And your 5 stars came in the form of not being clubbed to death for bad juju. And don't even try to say, well, at least they were outside and active. Yeah, in the same way, someone dangling off a cliff is technically getting fresh air. These men live surrounded by death rot and the looming threat of a disease that killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people globally. That's not outdoorsy. That's a job you take when literally no one else will hire you. The smell alone was a professional hazard. Imagine following a trail of rats into a medieval garbage heap, rotting, food-decomposing animals, spoiled milk sewage runoff. Now imagine doing that sober at 6 a.m. while covered in flea bites. Still think your open plan office is the worst. It's a wonder these guys didn't just start catching boats instead of rats. Except they couldn't. Most rat catchers were too poor to travel, too uneducated to flee, and too covered in plague bites to be welcome anywhere else. They were stuck, trapped in a sick loop of poverty, pestilence, and public disdain. Still, without them, medieval towns might have collapsed even faster than they already were. If society is a crumbling wagon, rat catchers were the mud-covered wheels holding it together, while everyone else pointed and screamed. Their reward. Being forgotten by history, buried anonymously under piles of the very filth they tried to stop. So next time you see a rat or even a slightly suspicious squirrel, say a silent thank you to the medieval madman who once chased disease through a rat-infested alley with nothing but a stick and a death wish. Then call pest control, spray some Lysol, and thank every god you know for antibiotics. Coming up next, a job so foul it made rats look clean. Meet the tanners who literally soaked themselves in filth for your fashion. Let's talk about leather. You've probably worn it, maybe sat on it or sniffed it in some overpriced boutique and said, real quality. Now imagine the process behind that leather involves human urine, rotting animal flesh and enough stink to chase flies into early retirement. Welcome to tanning in the Middle Ages, a job so nauseating it made even the rats hold their breath. Tanners were the unsung heroes of medieval fashion. If your idea of fashion involves blood poop and third-degree skin irritation. They took raw animal hides, often complete with fur fat and maggots, and transformed them into usable material for shoes, belts, armour or books. Sounds noble, right? Sure, until you realise it meant working ankle-deep in liquefied filth with the scent profile of Satan's laundry hamper. Step 1 in tanning, scrape the flesh off dead animals. No gloves, no mask, just you a dull knife and a thick slice of what the hell is that smell? Imagine peeling a month-old steak with your bare hands while standing in the sun. Now do that 100 times a day. Bonus points if the hide belonged to a diseased animal. Hello, anthrax exposure. But we're just getting started. Once the flesh was off, it was time to soak the hides. And not in rosewater. No, they used vats of urine, dog poop, pigeon droppings, and sometimes even human feces. Why? Because ammonia breaks down fat and softens the skin. Science, baby. Medieval science smelled like a sewer threw up. Let that sink in. Part of your job was to collect pee. Tanners would go door to door asking for it. Some towns even had designated public pee buckets labelled "for tanner use only." Imagine having to explain that to your house guests. "Oh, don't mind that pot by the fireplace, it's for Jeff, he dips dead animals in it." The mixture they used was called bait. Picture a sludgy cocktail of feces and urine fermenting under the summer sun. Now imagine standing over it day in and day out while dunking dead cow skins in it, like some horrifying spa treatment from hell. If the smell didn't kill you, the infections might. The fumes caused everything from lung damage to eye inflammation, and permanent loss of smell was considered a perk. Oh, and forget boots or aprons. Most tanners worked in rags if they had anything at all. The muck would soak into their skin, their clothes, their soul. They went home smelling like decay. Not metaphorically, literally. People could smell a tanner from across the marketplace. It wasn't a job you could keep secret. In fact, the stench was so bad, tanners were often forced to live on the outskirts of town. Cities didn't want them near wells churches or anywhere that normal people might accidentally inhale. You weren't just socially distant, you were legally distant. Medieval zoning laws were basically "you stink, go away." Even other poor people looked down on tanners. That's how bad it was. In a society where bathing was optional and teeth were mostly imaginary, tanners were too gross to hang out with. That's like being the smelly kid in a gym full of corpses. No one sat with you at lunch. No one invited you to the festival. You were the human equivalent of a sewer grate. But hey, at least it paid well, right? Wrong. It paid like dirt, and not even clean dirt. Tanners earned just enough to survive, which in medieval terms means didn't die yet. You didn't climb the social ladder. You just hoped the next hide you handled didn't give you sepsis, retirement plan, death. The irony, tanners were essential to society. Nobles needed leather for armour. Priests needed leather-bound books. Knights needed saddles. Everyone needed shoes. Without tanners, half the population would have been barefoot, bookless and butt-naked. But respect, nah. They were treated like diseased ghosts who happened to make belts. Let's do a modern comparison. Imagine working in a chemical plant that leaks into your boots every day. Your boss pays you in half-rotted bread. The town hates you, your house smells like fermented urine, and your job description includes scrape brains off skin. Still think your customer service gig is the worst. Yes, I said brains. That's another delightful part of the process. Tanners sometimes used animal brains to soften hides. It worked surprisingly well. The saying "every animal has just enough brains to tan its own hide" is actually true. But it also meant you were rubbing grey matter into cow skin while inhaling human pee vapour. Medieval multitasking. And then there were the accidents. Slip and fall into a vat of bait, you might not come out. Infection from a small cut that hand's gone. Ammonia burns in your lungs. Good luck breathing through the wheezing. And there were no hospitals, just prayers and maybe a leech if someone felt fancy. Despite all of this, people lined up to be tanners. Why? Because it was work. Disgusting, dehumanizing work, but better than starving. Better than dying on a battlefield. Better than begging with no fingers because frostbite claimed them last winter. That's how low the bar was. If you had working limbs and didn't vomit at the smell of hot feces, congrats, you were tanner material. You'd think this profession would fade away, but nope, it stuck around for centuries. Even into the early modern era, tanners were still out there dunking hides in homemade stew of regret and praying they didn't inhale too hard. Eventually, industrialization made things slightly better. Less poop, more chemicals. Yay. So next time you hold a leather wallet, take a moment, close your eyes. Imagine a man in torn rags, knee-deep in a vat of cow skin and piss, wiping his brow with the same hand he used to scrape maggots off a goat. Then ask yourself, do you really need another pair of leather boots? Coming up next, Fullers, because apparently laundry used to be even more disgusting. Hope you're ready for more human waste and foot-stomping madness. Just when you thought medieval hygiene couldn't get worse than tanners bathing in fermented cow goo, allow me to introduce the Fullers. These were the folks in charge of cleaning and preparing wool, by which I mean stomping on it in giant vats of human urine. Yes, again with the P. Welcome to another glamorous entry in the history of jobs that could kill you and your social life. Here's how it worked. Raw, wool was greasy, sticky and filthy straight off the sheep. To make it wearable, someone had to remove the lanolin, natural wax, dirt, blood, sheep poop and general stench. That someone was the fuller, a poor soul who literally stomped on the wool for hours, often barefoot inside giant barrels of warm urine. And if you just gagged a little good, that means your imagination is working. Why urine, you ask? Because medieval chemistry was basically, if it smells awful, it probably works. Urine contains ammonia, which breaks down grease and softens the fibres. So instead of soap, because who needs soap when you have pea Fullers, would collect buckets of liquid gold from townspeople, taverns, and even public urinals. In some cities, it was an official civic duty to donate your daily whiz to the wool industry. The fulling process itself was medieval CrossFit. Step into a barrel dump in the wool and start stomping like you're squashing grapes. Only the grapes are wet sheep hair soaked in Uncle Greg's morning pee. Fullers did this for hours. No music, no shoes, just the sound of splashing ammonia and your own feet slowly pruning like boiled sausages. Some tried to make it easier by using wooden paddles or rods, but most of the time it was bare legs doing the dirty work. Blisters, chemical burns and trench foot were common. Infection, absolutely. Let's not forget that any nick or scratch easily earned while kicking around soggy wool could turn into a full-body fever and a one-way trip to the churchyard. And this wasn't just a solo activity. In larger cities, fullers worked in fulling mills where massive wooden hammers pounded the wool mechanically. That sounds better until you remember that these mills were powered by water wheels and had zero safety standards. Fall into one, you got pulped like a medieval smoothie. And OSHA still wouldn't exist for another 700 years. Now socially, fullers ranked slightly above tanners, but still well below respected human. People knew they were necessary. No fullers, no clean wool, no clothing, but no one wanted to sit next to them at the feast. Imagine the scent of someone who spent all day marinating in other people's bodily fluids and sheep sweat. That's not just bad. That's change religion and move towns bad. In fact, the stench was so powerful, fullers were frequently exiled to the edges of towns near rivers, away from marketplaces and preferably downwind. Medieval cities were basically smell-based caste systems, and fullers were somewhere near the bottom. They didn't even get cool titles like Master of the Loom. They were just that guy who smells like feet and pee. But let's give credit where it's due, fullers were crucial to the textile industry. Once the wool was stomped into submission, it could be rinsed, stretched and dyed. Then it was spun into cloth used for robes, tunics, cloaks, and every other form of medieval self-respect. So without fullers, the entire feudal world would be running around in itchy, unprocessed sheep hair, which honestly still might have smelled better. Fun fact, in Roman times, fullers were so important that laws regulated their urine supply. That's right, the government taxed pee. The Latin phrase pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, originated from taxes on urine collection for fulling. So the next time someone tells you history's boring, remind them it once involved pee economics. Back in medieval times, this profession was also a family affair. Sons followed fathers into the fulling pits. generations of feet pummeling wool in a proud, smelly tradition. Imagine passing down a legacy like that. Son, one day all of this will be yours. The barrel, the wool, and the ankle rash. A true heirloom. And if you're wondering how fullers dealt with the sheer monotony of their job, well, some drank. Heavily. Others sang songs to keep rhythm. But mostly they just endured. Because when you're stuck in a barrel of pee for 10 hours a day, endure becomes the default life setting. There's no career growth, just career sogginess. And yes, there were female fullers too. Equality medieval style. Women stomped, scraped and sloshed right alongside the men with all the same risks and none of the recognition. Gender equity meant everyone got trench foot. Hooray. Let's compare this to laundry today. You throw your clothes in a machine, press a button and boom, fresh-smelling socks. Maybe your detergent has lavender extract. Maybe your biggest complaint is that your dryer shrank your hoodie. Medieval fullers would punch you in the throat for complaining. Gently, of course, because their feet are still recovering from 30 years in ammonia soup. Even after fulling, the job wasn't done. The cloth had to be stretched and dried on giant wooden frames called tenters. Yes, that's where the phrase on tenterhooks comes from. You literally stretched the fabric tight on hooks and hoped it didn't rip. And if it did, you got blamed. Not the wool, not the weather. You. Now imagine it's winter. You're in an open-air workshop barefoot in freezing piss water, your feet numb, your nose dripping, and your boss yelling at you because the cloth isn't fluffy enough. You want a raise. Here's a mouldy turnip. Go buy yourself a better sense of smell. So why did people do this? Same reason they did every awful job in the Middle Ages. They were broke. Starving. Trapped in a system where the only thing worse than a terrible job was no job. You either stomped wool or you begged in the streets and hoped the lepers were feeling generous that day. Still, fullers weren't without a sense of pride. Some were respected within their own communities, kind of like a support group for the footsore and nostril dead. They had their own guilds, sometimes even their own saints. St. Clement, for instance, was the patron saint of fullers and hatters. Because if anyone needed divine intervention, it was the guy wringing urine from a sheep pelt. And here's a dark cherry on top: fullers sometimes died young, from infections, exposure, respiratory damage, or just slipping on a slick patch of fermented filth and cracking their skull open. Death by laundry. Not exactly a poetic end, but very on brand for the era. So next time you complain about folding clothes while watching Netflix, remember the medieval fuller. Remember the blisters, the stench, the hours of pea-soaked stomping. Then maybe light a candle, or at least change your socks. Coming up next, meet the men who literally shoveled medieval society's darkest secrets, the gong farmers. Every society needs someone to clean up the mess. In the Middle Ages, that person was called a gong farmer, a title that sounds oddly whimsical, until you find out what it actually means: professional poop shoveler. Their entire job revolved around human waste, literally. Knee-deep in it every day in the pitch-black underbelly of castles, towns, and humanity itself. The term gong comes from the Old English gang meaning to go. So yes, these were the men who managed your goings. Medieval sanitation was just a fancy way of saying dig a big hole and hope for the best. When those holes called cesspits filled up, the gong farmers were summoned. Armed with shovels, buckets, and the sheer will to not vomit, they descended into the pits of despair. Most of their work happened at night. Why? Because the smell was so violent that townspeople didn't want to be anywhere near them during daylight. Also, darkness made it slightly easier to pretend these men weren't covered in decades-old human excrement. Imagine the scent, a warm blend of feces, rot, and crushed hope, marinated over years and occasionally sprinkled with decomposing rats for flavour. Gong farmers didn't just deal with fresh waste. Oh no, they dug through centuries of it. In big cities, cesspits could be meters deep, layer upon horrifying layer. No protective gear, no gloves, no gas mask, just a wooden ladder, a rope and a prayer. You climbed down, held your breath, and hoped the methane didn't knock you out cold. 'Cause yes, people passed out in these pits and some never woke up. Let's pause and reflect. Your office may have a terrible coffee machine or a loud coworker, but it doesn't kill you with methane gas while you stand ankle deep in fecal archaeology. Gong farmers were one wrong breath away from asphyxiation, and even if you managed to stay conscious, slipping on a patch of sludge could mean drowning. In poop. Welcome to medieval hazard pay. The tools of the trade. Simple. A long-handled shovel, a metal bucket, and a cart to haul the waste away. If you were lucky, maybe a leather apron. Most of the time you just worked in whatever clothes you didn't mind burning later, and you did burn them often, because no amount of scrubbing could erase the memory or the smell of what you'd just waded through. Once the buckets were filled, the waste had to be dumped somewhere. Gong farmers usually transported it to the outskirts of town where it was buried or spread over fields as fertilizer. Yes, your ancestors' wheat may have been grown in human excrement. Bon appétit. And if the wind shifted the wrong way, entire villages got a sudden reminder of what lunch smelled like a few days ago. You'd think with all this filth they'd be social outcasts, and you'd be mostly right. People avoided them like the plague, ironically, while ignoring the rats actually spreading the plague. Gong farmers couldn't enter churches, taverns, or sometimes even markets. They were ghosted before ghosting was cool. No one wanted to shake hands with a poop man. But here's the weird twist: Gong farmers were well paid. Compared to other medieval jobs, shoveling human waste actually earned you decent coin. Why? Because no one else wanted to do it. Danger stench social exile. It was the perfect storm of career hell, and it paid accordingly. In fact, some accounts suggest gong farmers earned more than blacksmiths or carpenters, because apparently gold can be found in brown. There was also a hierarchy. Some were independent contractors, while others worked for the local lord or city council. If you ran a team of gong farmers, you were basically the CEO of waste. Imagine having to organise shift rotations based on methane exposure levels. Jeff passed out last week, give him the shallow pit tonight. Let's take a moment to appreciate how medieval urban planning made this job even worse. Castles had guardrobes, basically vertical toilets that dropped straight into pits or moats. Some were overhanging ledges with direct sky-to-crap trajectories. Others had hidden passageways leading to deep underground chambers. The deeper the chamber, the older and smellier the contents. By the time a gong farmer got down there, it was less of a pit and more of a fermentation chamber of nightmares. And these weren't just city problems. Even small villages had cesspits, and if they overflowed during heavy rains, which happened often, you'd get rivers of human waste snaking through the streets. Gong farmers were expected to respond like some sort of medieval hazmat team, only without the suits, or the respect, or the pensions. Still, their job had one perk. They knew all the castle secrets. Literally. They worked beneath floors and behind walls, overhearing conversations and finding lost items that nobles flushed down the hole. Jewellery coins, knives, incriminating letters. If you dropped it, the gong farmer probably found it and may or may not have kept it. Can't blame them. Hazard pay includes hazard bonuses. Of course, all it took was one slip-up for things to go from bad to fatal. There are recorded cases of gong farmers falling in and suffocating. The pit would collapse, or the ladder would snap, or the fumes would knock them out mid-shovel. Imagine your obituary died heroically in the line of duty. It didn't help that diseases thrived in these environments. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all favourites of the cesspit crowd. And with no medical care, even a simple infection could end in a slow, smelly death. Your body might be discovered days later when someone noticed the flies getting unusually aggressive. Compare that to today's sanitation workers' uniforms, gloves, masks, training. Modern sewage systems are literal miracles of engineering. Waste gets pumped, filtered and processed with clinical precision. In medieval times you were the filter, and the pump, and the regret. Yet despite the horror, the gong farmer had job security. As long as humans continued to eat and poop, and let's face it, they're very committed to both, this job would never go out of style. Medieval cities needed them more than they needed knights. You could live without armour. You couldn't live ankle deep in your neighbour's diarrhea. Let's say it together, now thank the plumbers. So the next time you flush and walk away like it's no big deal, whisper a word of gratitude to the guy who once had to manually retrieve that waste in the dark with a bucket and a dream. He didn't have a union. He didn't have gloves. He just had a shovel, a strong stomach, and a higher than average chance of dying face first in history's most disgusting soup. Coming up next, executioners, because medieval justice needed someone to swing the axe and then live with the screams. So you want job security in the Middle Ages, something steady, well compensated with a clear purpose. Great. Here's a gig that rarely had vacancies because, well, nobody wanted to shake hands with the guy who removed hands for a living. Welcome to the world of medieval executioners, part butcher, part theatre performer, and full-time outcast with a blade. Let's be clear, this was not a job you applied for. There was no interview process where someone asked, "So how do you handle pressure?" Most executioners were born into the role usually because their father was one, or they were criminals given a twisted deal, kill for the state or die by the state. Not exactly the HR onboarding experience of your dreams. On paper, the job sounded straightforward. You kill people. But in practice, it was a logistical nightmare of nerves, gore and crowd management. Because remember, executions weren't private affairs, they were public spectacles. Your performance determined whether the mob cheered, wept, or threw turnips at your head. One bad swing and you didn't just fail, you traumatized an entire village. And medieval tools weren't surgical instruments. The sword, heavy, the axe, unbalanced, the block, slick with blood from the last 10 poor souls, the rope frayed. Sometimes it took more than one blow to get the job done, and nothing kills the vibe like having to hack someone's neck while the crowd gasps and your assistant quietly throws up behind you. Let's talk about that botched executions. They happened all the time. Nerves, poor aim, bad weather, it didn't take much. There are accounts of executioners missing the neck entirely and slicing through someone's jaw. Or worse, not even breaking the skin on the first swing. That's not just a bad day at the office. That's medieval performance anxiety with stakes measured in limbs. Ever wonder what it's like to be feared and needed at the same time? That was the executioner's social life in a nutshell. He had power over life and death, but no one invited him to weddings. Children were told not to make eye contact. Priests hesitated to bless his food. Because in a world dripping with superstition, being near death every day made you unclean spiritually and physically. Which is ironic because these men were often deeply religious. Some prayed before each execution, others fasted, a few even cried. They weren't heartless brutes, just men doing the job that society demanded, then immediately punished them for doing. Think of it as a medieval version of Don't Shoot the Messenger, except the messenger carries a 10-pound axe and has PTSD, and the trauma. Oh, it was real. Killing strangers for a living messes with your brain even when the church says it's okay. Executioners often drank heavily. Some kept to themselves in isolated cottages. Others reportedly heard voices or saw the ghosts of those they executed. You don't just go home and play with your kids after separating someone's head from their sins. Still, the job had perks, decent pay, free housing, exemptions from certain taxes, and believe it or not, the right to loot the bodies. After a beheading, executioners could keep the clothes, jewellery, and sometimes even the teeth of the condemned. Morally grotesque, sure. But medieval morality was flexible, especially when cash was involved. There were also some weird side gigs. Need someone to administer torture before a confession? Call the executioner. Want someone to brand a thief's face with hot iron executioner again? Need to break a wheel, burn a witch, or boil someone alive, you guessed it. He was the Swiss Army knife of medieval punishment minus the tiny scissors. Let's not forget the logistics of large executions. Sometimes you had to deal with dozens of bodies. In peasant uprisings or heretic purges, it wasn't one or two people, it was a human assembly line. One swing after another under the sun with blood soaking your boots and the crowd howling like it's a soccer match. That's not justice. That's psychological erosion with the cheering section. And then came the celebrity status, sort of. In larger cities, executioners were known by name. Some were even admired from a distance. They became part of local legend-feared enforcers of law, whispered about in taverns, avoided in public squares. Children made up rhymes about them. Adults made up lies about not seeing them. Still think your office drama is stressful. Try having your job depend on killing people cleanly, or else you get publicly humiliated, spiritually shunned, and maybe stabbed by the victim's cousin. At least your spreadsheets don't scream back. The most infamous executioners often wrote journals. Some were shockingly reflective. They didn't brag, they confessed. One German executioner from the 16th century left behind a record of every execution he performed, including how many swings it took and how he felt afterward. It wasn't glory, it was guilt in ink. And yet, in a dark, twisted way, executioners believed they were doing good. They were the hand of justice. They kept order. They gave people closure. That's how they slept at night when they could sleep. Because nothing says bedtime like remembering the sound of a vertebra snapping under your blade. Let's compare this to today's justice system. Judges pass sentences, guards oversee inmates and executions, where legal happen far from public eyes. Sterile, silent procedural. In the Middle Ages, justice was a blood-stained pageant. You bought a meat pie, watched someone die, and went home feeling spiritually superior. And that brings us to the biggest irony of all: executioners were victims of the very system they upheld. They were agents of the law, yet shunned by society. Revered then reviled. When they died, many weren't buried in consecrated ground. The church, it seemed, appreciated the work, but not the worker. Medieval HR strikes again. So the next time your boss gives you an awkward task like writing passive-aggressive emails or firing Ted from sales, take a moment. At least you're not wiping your blade on your sleeve while villagers chant off with his head in unison. At least your work doesn't follow you home in the form of dreams soaked in screams. Coming up next, Plague Doctors, because when medicine involves bird masks and bad smells, you know, it's about to get fatal. If you think today's medical profession is stressful, try diagnosing someone with bubonic plague while wrapped in black robes, leather gloves, and a bird mask stuffed with herbs. That's not cosplay. That's a medieval plague doctor. You weren't saving lives. You were keeping a death tally, hoping the stench of rotting flesh didn't soak into your soul. And spoiler, it absolutely did. The beak. Oh yes, let's talk about the beak. People today think it's quirky, spooky, Halloween-worthy. In reality, it was desperation masquerading as science. Doctors filled the long nose with lavender mint and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. The theory smells were dangerous and good smells protected you. Medieval logic at its finest: if I can't smell death, it can't kill me. These doctors waddled through plague-ridden streets like ominous black crows. Robes soaked in wax, canes in hand, and absolutely no illusions about their success rate. You see, plague doctors weren't miracle workers. They were human paperwork hired to record the dead estimate, who would die next and occasionally stab a boil if they were feeling ambitious. Bedside manner included screaming prayers and maybe a quick bloodletting to round things off. And no, they weren't trained physicians. Most plague doctors were glorified civil servants, or priests, or complete amateurs looking for a paycheck and a mass to hide behind. Town councils often hired them during outbreaks because no self-respecting doctor wanted to go near the sick. So they paid whatever man was willing to shuffle from corpse to corpse with a book of names and a rising sense of dread. The outfit was less about fashion and more about fear. The waxed cloak was meant to repel infected fluids. Yes, fluids were flying. The cane, that was for prodding the sick from a distance like diseased cattle, or lifting sheets to check if the patient was dead yet. No touching. Touching was how you ended up on the wrong side of the death cart. Their main job, not healing. It was documentation and segregation. Who's infected? Where do they live? Who do we seal inside their house and pretend we didn't hear them begging to come out? Plague doctors were walking beaked spreadsheets, and the data they collected grim, incomplete, and usually soaked in panic. And yet they did try, in their own horrifying, wildly ineffective ways. Some cut open the buboes to drain bad humours. Others prescribed crushed emeralds, roasted toads, or applying live chickens to the armpits. Yes, chickens. Somewhere someone said, try rubbing a squawking bird on that black lump, and it just became a thing. Medicine by rumour, sanity not included. Bloodletting was also a favourite because obviously when your body is shutting down from septic shock, the best idea is to remove more blood. Patients were drained, burned and force-fed weird soups. One recipe called for crushed roses, arsenic and mercury, which, to be fair, did kill bacteria along with every other part of the patient. But here's the real kicker. Plague doctors were also expected to testify in court. Let that sink in. After spending all day poking the half-dead with sticks, they'd be summoned to determine if someone's will was valid or if a crime had been committed before death. Imagine walking into a courtroom wearing a bird mask and declaring, "Yes, Your Honour." He seemed only partially dead when he signed. Despite the ridiculousness, their presence did offer psychological comfort. People saw the beak and thought, at least someone's trying. It was hope. Clumsy, sweaty, beaky hope. In a world where priests were dropping like flies and entire neighbourhoods vanished overnight, even symbolic help felt like a miracle. Of course, many plague doctors died. Shocker! Turns out a leather robe and a face filled with rosemary doesn't stop airborne bacteria. Some survived purely by luck, others were buried in the very graves they helped count. And unlike modern doctors, they weren't usually mourned. No statues, no eulogies, just another body in the pit. And yet the job persisted. With every new outbreak, Black Death, pneumonic plague, random summer pestilences, there came another beaked wanderer. By the 1600s, the costume was so infamous, it became a kind of grim cultural icon, the symbol of a city that had run out of answers and sent in the Birdman. Let's talk salary. Plague doctors were sometimes paid very well. Danger pay, they called it. Some earned the medieval equivalent of 6 figures. Others were paid in food shelter or the vague promise of not being lynched if the treatment failed. And trust me, it always failed. No one survived the plague because of a doctor. They survived despite the doctor. But there were exceptions, rare individuals who practiced some form of isolation hygiene or statistical tracking that wasn't completely idiotic. These guys were the precursors to modern epidemiologists. They noticed infection rates mapped outbreaks and realized too late that rats and fleas were the villains, not bad smells. Still try telling that to a town that thinks sneezing is a demonic curse. Compare this to modern medicine: masks, gloves, sterilized instruments, ventilators, antibiotics, vaccines. Plague doctors had garlic necklaces and incense. If you're feeling smug, you should be. You've got urgent care centres. They had urgent despair. Your pharmacist doesn't hand you a jar of fermented pigeon juice and tell you to smear it on your neck. Also, let's appreciate the mental health angle for a second. Being surrounded by rot, sobbing and death chants all day while wearing what looks like a haunted Halloween mask, that's not a recipe for emotional stability. Many plague doctors became emotionally numb or worse, superstitious wrecks, muttering about devil breezes and cursed wells. So why do we remember them? Because the mask stuck. The beak, the cloak, the eerie silhouette, it's unforgettable. A symbol of human fear turned into a uniform. They didn't stop the plague, but they documented it, witnessed it, became the most tragic mascots in medical history. Dark, clumsy angels in black waxed robes. You've got to admire the sheer commitment of it all. Waking up, putting on a bird mask and willingly entering a house full of moaning, oozing strangers just to scribble likely dead by Friday. No thanks. I'll take my office job, my coffee and my blessedly bird-free face. So the next time you cough and Google your symptoms, remember the guy who did house calls with a cane, a prayer and a stuffed nose full of thyme. And if you ever feel silly wearing a surgical mask on the subway, just remember, at least yours doesn't look like a raven that overdosed on despair. Coming up next, miners, because what's better than being crushed, gassed or buried alive for a handful of rocks? You think your workplace is dark and depressing? Try spending 12 hours a day underground in a hole so cramped you can't stand up straight, surrounded by choking dust, toxic gases, and the constant threat of cave-ins. Welcome to medieval mining, where your job was to extract shiny rocks from the bowels of hell, and maybe live to brag about it, assuming you still had lungs, eyes, or kneecaps. Mining in the Middle Ages wasn't a glamorous affair. There were no helmets, no safety goggles, and absolutely no emergency exits. It was just you, a pickaxe, a lantern, and the growing realization that the deeper you went, the worse your chances got. You weren't just digging into the earth, you were digging into your life expectancy. One rock slide away from becoming a permanent fixture in the mine. The air down there, less fresh mountain breeze, more hot metallic soup of doom. Oxygen was limited. Ventilation was primitive, sometimes just a hole in the ceiling, or worse, not at all. And that meant every breath was a gamble. You might inhale air, or you might inhale a delightful cocktail of carbon monoxide and sulfur fumes. Medieval miners didn't need cigarettes, they were smoking rocks by accident. Now let's talk about lighting. Torches and oil lamps were common, but guess what loves fire? Methane gas. That's right. In coal mines, even a tiny spark could turn your tunnel into an impromptu funeral pyre. Explosion deaths were so common, some miners just accepted it as a natural part of the workflow. Hey, where's Joran? He lit a lamp in shaft 6. Ah, so, new guy. And we haven't even gotten to the equipment. Tools were crude stone hammers, wooden wedges, iron picks, duller than a wet sponge. You didn't just chip away at rock. You fought it tooth and nail. If your pick broke, you kept going with your hands. If your hands bled, well, congratulations, now they're part of the rock. Water was another delightful hazard. Mines flooded constantly, and bailing it out meant carrying buckets up slippery ladders for hours. No pumps, no drainage systems, just aching backs and soggy boots. And if the water didn't drown you, it probably carried a nice selection of bacterial treats for your open wounds. Trench foot gangrene, fungal infections, you name it, they hosted it. Miners worked long hours, sometime from sunrise to well after dark, driven by lords and landowners who wanted silver salt iron or gold but didn't want to see the process. They paid just enough to keep you hungry and replaced you the second your spine gave out. Your job contract was basically, you break your body, we take your ore. And did I mention children? Oh yes, children were often shoved into narrow tunnels that adults couldn't fit into. These weren't mining interns, they were small humans with pickaxes and zero protection. They hauled or carried water and wedged themselves into airless cracks with all the cheer of someone who hadn't yet learned how to swear properly. The worst part, you could die just from the dust, especially in silver and lead mines where inhaling fine particles turned your lungs into sponges full of poison. You didn't cough, you rattled. Lung rot was so common it didn't even earn a fancy name. It was just miner's breath, and it meant you had about 2 years left before you drowned in your own chest. But it wasn't just lungs. Exposure to mercury, lead and arsenic ruined your nervous system. Your hands shook. Your vision blurred. You forgot your own name while still remembering how to swing a pickaxe. Some miners literally went mad from heavy metal exposure. And no, not the cool kind with guitars. And yet somehow this job was considered desirable in certain regions. Why? Because it paid. Not well, but better than starving. Better than freezing in a field or being trampled by your lord's horse. Some miners even formed tight-knit communities, shared meals, built shrines in the tunnels, and supported each other like a medieval brotherhood of doom. Of course, that solidarity didn't stop accidents. Tunnels collapsed often, especially in winter, when water froze and expanded in cracks. One shift you're working alongside your best friend, the next you're watching his body vanish under a wall of rock. Rescue missions. Nope. If you were buried deep. Best case scenario, someone carved your name into a splintery board and nailed it to the mine entrance. Mining towns were grim places, covered in soot, echoing with coughing fits and surrounded by slag heaps that poisoned the rivers. The landscape looked like Mordor with less optimism. People lived in shacks made from broken ore carts, and the local economy ran entirely on bread, booze and bribes. Religion thrived in these places because, let's face it, when your job is to walk into the earth every day and challenge death, you start making deals with any deity that'll listen. Miners had their own patron saints, rituals and folk prayers. Some wore protective charms. Others carved crosses into the tunnel walls like spiritual speed bumps. And if you died, good luck getting a proper burial. Many miners were buried near the mine in shallow graves marked with rocks. Some were left inside collapsed tunnels because digging them out was too dangerous. Your tombstone was a chunk of ore. Your eulogy was a shrug. Let's do a modern comparison. Today mining still exists, but with machinery, ventilation, protective gear unions and hazard pay. If something explodes, there's a report. If a worker coughs blood, they see a doctor. In the Middle Ages, if something exploded, it was just Wednesday. If you coughed blood, you shared it with your co-worker and got back to digging. But here's the final insult: most miners didn't even get to keep what they found. That silver vein you just uncovered belongs to the Lord. That gold nugget seized by the crown. The salt you broke your back over shipped to nobility. You didn't profit, you survived barely. You got paid in scraps while the ruling class bathed in riches you died for. Still miners kept going, because under all that soot and suffering there was pride. A stubborn, calloused kind of pride that said, "This tunnel might kill me, but I'll dig it anyway." They lit candles in the dark, sang songs to drown out the fear, and carved names into rock so anyone would remember them. So next time you complain about your cubicle being too cold, imagine working 200 feet underground with a torch, a pickaxe and toothache you can't afford to fix. Imagine choking on dust that'll eventually erase your memory. Imagine doing all that so some noble can wear a shinier belt buckle. Coming up next are the wives, because when women made beer, they made enemies, accusations, and sometimes witches. If you think your workplace has a gender bias, try being a woman in medieval Europe making beer only to be accused of witchcraft for being too good at it. Welcome to the world of alewives. The female brewers who sustained entire villages with their barley-based lifeblood, and were rewarded with suspicion, ridicule, and occasional fiery death. because nothing screams thank you for your service like being burned at the stake for crafting a solid pint. Before beer became an industrialized male-dominated commodity, it was women's work, literally. Brewing ale at home was as routine as baking bread or mending socks. Every household needed it. Water wasn't safe to drink, but ale. That was liquid nutrition. It had calories, mild alcohol, and fewer bacteria than the town well, which doubled as a communal bathtub and a convenient rat graveyard. So women, mostly widows or wives supplementing household income, began to brew in bulk. They became entrepreneurs, setting up small-scale production, selling from their doorsteps or stalls. These women were called alewives, and for a time they ran the show. They had the recipes, the equipment, the yeast cultures passed down like family heirlooms. And for a fleeting medieval moment they had power. But then came the problem success. When alewives started earning real money, male merchants and guilds got nervous. Women shouldn't have this much influence, they grumbled into their goblets. Enter the smear campaign. Suddenly the same symbols that once advertised ale pointy hats, cats to chase mice from the grain broomsticks to sweep the floor became signs of witchcraft. Sound familiar? Let's talk about the pointy hat. You've seen it, tall, conical, black. Originally it made an alewife visible in a crowded market, literally a branding tool. Look for the lady with the hat, that's where the good brew is. But once men wanted the industry, that hat became sinister. Pointy hat must be communing with Satan. Efficient marketing turned into a death sentence. Same with the broomstick. Other wives would hang a broom outside their door to signal a fresh batch was ready. Today it'd be a neon open sign. Back then it became a magical object. Clearly she's flying on that thing at night to attend demonic keggers, and the cat's just mouse control. But apparently if a woman had a cat and brewed beer, she wasn't just running a business, she was running with the devil. Of course the church got involved, because if women were making beer and not babies, that was clearly a threat to divine order. Sermons began condemning loose women of ale, linking brewing to temptation, moral corruption, and you guessed it, hellfire. The alewife became a scapegoat for everything from drunkenness to crop failure. You say the barley rotted must be that woman who sells good beer and smiles too much. Burn her. The irony. These women brewed safer drinks than the official alternatives. Many knew how to filter flavour and store ale without it turning into gut-churning poison. But facts didn't matter. The more skilled an alewife was, the more suspicious she became. If her ale healed your stomachache, sorcery. If it killed bacteria, heresy. If it sold well, definitely unnatural. Some towns passed laws restricting when and how women could brew. Others banned them outright. Guilds previously open to alewives closed ranks, admitting only men. And just like that, women were pushed out of an industry they'd built from yeast and sweat. Their tools became symbols of evil, their recipes stolen, their names erased. Still many refused to give up. They brewed in secret or under male relatives' names. They bartered ale instead of selling it or traded it within female networks. These women weren't just brewers, they were resistance fighters armed with hops and sheer grit. Every pint they poured was an act of defiance in a world that wanted them barefoot, pregnant, and preferably silent. Let's compare that to today. Brewing is now trendy, artisanal, hipster-approved. Bearded men in flannel shirts talk about malt profiles and craft microbatches. They name their beers things like Dragon's Breath IPA or Ye Olde Fermentation. But how often do they credit the women who invented the entire system? Spoiler, not nearly enough. And what about the taste? Medieval alewives were early chemists. They experimented with herbs long before hops were standard. Some used rosemary, yarrow, or bog myrtle for flavour and preservation. This concoction was called Groot, and it gave alewives a unique edge, until hops were promoted by male brewers because it standardized taste and lasted longer. Innovation erased by shelf life. Being an alewife wasn't just brewing, it was risk management. You needed to secure grain sometimes illegally. You had to brew in unpredictable weather. You had to avoid contamination, manage customers, and fend off church accusations, all while doing laundry, raising kids, and defending your existence as not a witch. Let's not forget the money. A successful alewife could support an entire household. That meant independence terrifying for a world obsessed with female submission. A woman with money didn't need a husband. A woman with her own business could make her own decisions. To many men in power, that was more threatening than any plague. Alewives also played vital social roles. Their homes were gathering places. Their brews brought people together. Weddings, funerals, harvests all soaked in ale. In a world constantly teetering on starvation or war, they created moments of comfort, joy, and yes, intoxication. But apparently that wasn't wholly enough. What happened when they were caught? Sometimes fines, sometimes banishment, sometimes worse. They were accused of using cunning arts, dragged before courts, forced to confess under torture. And in some cases, particularly during witch-hunting frenzies, they were executed. Burned not for actual crimes, but for being good at their job. Because nothing says justice like killing the one person who knows how to brew potable liquid. Even when they weren't accused of witchcraft, alewives faced slander. Songs, jokes, and pamphlets mocked them as ugly, drunk, or lazy. Popular literature painted them as greedy hags watering down beer and flirting with customers. You know, classic misogyny. Call it the original Karen meme, just with more fermentation. Despite all this, alewives persisted in folklore. The Witch of Modern Halloween. Probably an exaggerated caricature of a successful female brewer. That hat, that cat, that broom, they weren't magical at first. They were practical. They were entrepreneurial. But over time, society decided they were dangerous. So next time you sip a cold one, remember the woman who brewed in a wooden barrel while the church whispered about demons. The woman who risked everything to provide clean drink to a village that didn't deserve her. The woman who smiled at a customer and got accused of sorcery. Raise your glass to her. Coming up next, leech collectors, because nothing says fun career like wading into swamps and bleeding for a living. If your job description includes stand in cold swamp water while bloodthirsty parasites attach to your legs, you might want to reconsider your career path. But in medieval Europe, that job had a title, a routine, and believe it or not, a paycheck. Welcome to the horrifyingly real world of leech collectors. Men, women, and children who literally offered up their own flesh in exchange for squirming, slimy profit. You didn't just harvest leeches, you fed them with your body. Back then, leeches weren't disgusting, they were medicine. Doctors swore by them. Got a fever, leech it. Swollen joints, leeches. Bad vibes. Probably a leech situation. Bloodletting was the cure-all of the time, and leeches were the portable version of medieval phlebotomy. No blades, no mess, just one little sucker draining away your sins, or at least your platelets. So naturally someone had to gather these wriggling miracle worms. That someone was the leech collector. No fancy title, no coat of arms, just a burlap sack, some rolled-up trousers, and a complete disregard for personal safety. Collectors waded into marshes, bogs, and reedy streams where leeches bred like nightmares. The water was cold, the footing was treacherous, and the leeches, they were hungry. Here's the fun part, you didn't catch leeches with tools, you caught them with your own flesh. Collectors would stand still in waist-deep water, often for hours waiting for the leeches to latch on. Once enough had attached, and once the bleeding got a bit too dramatic, they'd climb out, pluck the suckers off, and shove them into jars or tins. It was like being a walking buffet, except the customers were blind, bloodthirsty worms. And this wasn't a once-a-day situation. No, you might go back in multiple times. You might bleed from the same spots. Some collectors used their legs, others used their arms. In truly dedicated, desperate moments, People used livestock as bait, tie up a goat, let the leeches swarm it, then collect the engorged prizes. Animal cruelty, maybe. But let's be honest, it beat bleeding out in a bog yourself. Now let's talk health risks. For starters, infection. You're standing in cold, stagnant water with open wounds. Combine that with zero antiseptics, no antibiotics, and an immune system already taxed by malnutrition, and you've got a recipe for gangrene sepsis, or worse. Oh, and leeches secrete anticoagulants, so those bite wounds, they just keep bleeding. Sometimes for hours. Some collectors fainted from blood loss. Others got fevers, hallucinations, or never made it out of the marsh at all. The cold itself was a killer. Many collectors worked barefoot or half naked because wet clothes meant hypothermia faster than you could say this is a terrible life choice. Imagine standing in a muddy bog before dawn, shivering so hard your teeth rattle, trying to swat mosquitoes while your legs are slowly becoming leech snacks. That's not a job. That's a horror movie. And then there were the predators. Not just human ones, though. Yes, bandits did sometimes target leech gatherers for their precious cargo, but actual animals. Swamps are full of snakes, snapping turtles, wild boars, and deeply territorial geese. And if you thought being pecked by a goose while bleeding from both legs was the low point of your week, you were wrong. That came when you tried to sell your leeches and got underpaid. Yes, the market was brutal. A dozen healthy leeches might earn you a few coins enough for stale bread and maybe a turnip. But if your haul was small, sickly, or already fed too much, no sale. Leeches needed to be hungry for the doctors to use them, so collectors often starved their catch in clean water for days, which meant even more work just to keep their inventory viable. Welcome to Quality Control Medieval Edition. And no, you didn't get any medical credit. The doctors got the glory, the patients got the placebo, and you got the bleeding ankles and a handful of loose change. In fact, many towns considered leech collectors dirty, both literally and socially. They worked in mud, smelled like fish rot, and occasionally passed out in public from blood loss. Not exactly society's golden children. Some leech collectors were women, especially widows or unmarried mothers. Why? Because it was one of the few jobs that didn't require guild membership, male sponsorship, or even literacy. Just a body and a high pain tolerance. And of course, being a woman who worked with blood and strange creatures often got you labelled unnatural or witchy. So there's that added perk of being feared and underpaid. Children were also employed. Why, they were small, nimble, and easy to send into deeper water. Some were orphans, others were sold into labour. Imagine being 8 years old and starting your workday by wading into a fog-covered bog, hoping the leeches didn't go for your face. Medieval childhood was basically adult suffering in a smaller package, and yet this job persisted for centuries. Why? Because demand. As long as bloodletting was in style, and it was in style for a long time, leeches were the medical gold standard. Every nobleman's doctor wanted them. Every apothecary stocked them. Some were even exported to other countries, and every one of them started out clinging to the shin of someone who couldn't afford a second pair of pants. Let's fast forward to today. Modern medicine uses leeches in microsurgery, yes, really, to restore blood flow and prevent tissue death. But it's done in sterile environments with trained specialists and lab-grown specimens. No one's out there in a bog at sunrise bleeding into the mist while muttering about bread prices. Progress. Still, the leech collectors left a mark on medicine, on folklore, and definitely on their own legs. They remind us that behind every miracle cure is often a nameless, underpaid, overworked person who suffered to make it possible. They didn't write textbooks. They didn't get statues. But without them, half of Europe's sick patients would have bled out the old-fashioned way with knives, guesswork, and a splash of religious guilt. So next time someone says the Middle Ages were simpler times, show them a picture of a barefoot woman waist-deep in bog water, covered in blood and leeches, trying to earn enough to feed her kids. Simple. Maybe. If your definition of simple includes parasites, hypothermia, and death by infection, coming up next, messengers, because when your job is to deliver bad news through war zones with zero GPS, you learn to run fast or die trying. Every office has that one poor soul who's always sent to deliver the bad news. In medieval times, that role was a full-time job. Meet the messenger, the original middle manager of misfortune. Only instead of Slack notifications and awkward hallway chats, they delivered royal decrees, ransom notes, and declarations of war, often while dodging arrows and dysentery. You weren't just the mailman. You were the human embodiment of don't shoot the messenger, except people absolutely did. Being a messenger in the Middle Ages meant travelling hundreds of miles on foot or horseback, with a sack full of secrets and a face no one trusted. You carried letters between king's reports between generals, or summons from local lords. Sometimes it was routine business. Other times you were riding straight into enemy territory with a scroll that basically said, "We'd like to kill your prince now. Sincerely, King Harold." Unsurprisingly, you didn't always make it back. Let's be clear, there was no uniform for messengers. No badge. No government-issued papers saying, "Don't stab this guy." The best you could hope for was a wax seal and a prayer. You looked like a vagrant with a backpack, and unless the recipient was polite enough to read before attacking your job, had a high chance of ending in a shallow grave. You were disposable. Like medieval email, but made of meat. The roads, oh the roads. Mud pits in summer, ice sheets in winter, full of wolves, bandits, and aggressive locals who didn't like strangers. Bridges were rare. Inns were expensive. If you were lucky, you slept in a barn. If you were unlucky, you slept in a ditch and woke up with half your supplies stolen and the other half peed on by goats. It was DoorDash meets the Revenant. Now imagine doing this in a war zone. You're sent to deliver a message to a general whose camp keeps moving. You ride through the night, avoiding scouts, hiding from archers, trying not to step in bodies. You finally find the camp, announce your business, and they threaten to kill you anyway because you're suspicious. Which, fair enough, you do smell like fear and dead horse. And no one trains you. There's no messenger academy. You learn on the job, which usually means from someone who dies in front of you. First lesson, don't wear anything nice. It attracts thieves. Second lesson, don't ask questions. You don't want to know what's in the scroll marked "burn" after reading. Third lesson, run. Always run. Let's talk weather. Because medieval Europe wasn't exactly sunny. Rain meant flooding, snow meant frostbite. Wind meant your message could literally blow away while you chased it across a field like a panicked chicken. And God help you if lightning struck, because the only thing less grounded than a medieval road was your understanding of meteorology. A sign from heaven, they'd say, as you collapsed from heatstroke or froze to the saddle. And the pay miserable. Unless you were a royal courier working directly for the crown, you got whatever scraps the town council had lying around. Maybe some bread, maybe a blanket, maybe a thank you and a slap on the back hard enough to loosen a vertebra. You weren't paid in gold, you were paid in tolerance. Now you might ask, why do it at all? Because other options were somehow worse. You could work in the mines or shovel dung or bleed into a swamp with the leech collectors. At least as a messenger you saw new places, met interesting people, and occasionally lived to complain about it. Adventure was built into the job description, as was trauma, and yes, women were messengers too, especially within religious communities between monasteries or among noble households. These women faced all the same dangers with the added bonus of being ignored, underestimated or accused of espionage. Travelling alone as a woman in medieval Europe was like playing Frogger on a dirt road where every frog has a knife. There's also the matter of memory. Not all messages were written down. Some were delivered orally, especially if they were sensitive or time-critical. That meant memorising entire speeches, names, directions, and escape routes. One mistake, one mispronunciation. You could start a war, or worse, be accused of lying and executed on the spot. Medieval information security was a man with a good memory and zero bladder control. And don't forget about language barriers. Europe was a tangled web of dialect accents and people who hated each other. You might deliver a French message in a Flemish village and get pelted with turnips. Or worse, they pretend to understand and completely misinterpret it. Wait, did you say invade at dawn? Or trade at dawn? Sometimes messengers had to act. Pretend to be a trader, pretend to be sick, pretend to be part of a wedding party just to get through enemy checkpoints. These weren't just delivery boys, they were part-time spies with the job security of a matchstick. And if you were caught acting, oh boy, torture first, questions later. And if you died en route, too bad. The message didn't care. They'd send another poor soul with a copy and you'd become a cautionary tale. Don't be like Edwin. Edwin stopped for soup. Edwin got eaten by a bear. Entire villages passed down stories of messengers who vanished their last known location, marked by a mysteriously angry goose and some ominous footprints. Let's look at the morbid glory. Sometimes the messages themselves were deadly, literally. If you were carrying a royal decree of execution, the person receiving it might just kill you out of reflex. Oh, you came to tell me I'm being executed? Fantastic. I'm starting with you. Or the reverse, someone pretends to be a messenger, delivers a fake message and walks out with a sack of stolen gold. Yes, medieval phishing scams were analogue and covered in horse poop. Compare this to modern delivery jobs. Today, if your Amazon driver is late, the worst that happens is a bad review. In medieval times, if your messenger was late, the peace treaty didn't happen. The war escalated. Towns burned, families fled, all because someone got stuck in the mud or trampled by a mule. High stakes, low pay, zero dental. And there was no tracking system, no carrier pigeons with GPS, no message read notifications, just trust. Blind, desperate trust that your half-starved rider wouldn't be ambushed, lose the scroll or mistake a witch trial for a dinner party. That's why kings used multiple messengers for the same message. Redundancy by human sacrifice. Yet despite everything, bandits, frostbite, plague messengers were respected. Kind of. They were seen as necessary evils. Not loved, not hated, just tolerated. Like bad weather or mildly cursed bread. And when they succeeded, when they crossed kingdoms, defied odds, and delivered news that changed everything, they disappeared back into the mist. No applause, no statue, just another name in a logbook may be misspelled. So next time you get annoyed at a late text or lost package, take a breath. At least you're not dodging arrows with a scroll tied to your thigh while wolves circle and the sky opens up. At least your job doesn't require memorizing death threats in 4 languages and navigating through enemy territory on a horse that hasn't slept since Tuesday. Coming up next, medieval cooks, where food poisoning wasn't a mistake, it was Tuesday's special. So you think cooking's stressful because you overcooked pasta once? Try whipping up a meal for a medieval noble who might stab you if the soup's too salty, and whose pantry includes ingredients that could kill a goat on contact. Welcome to the blazing, boiling, back-breaking life of a medieval cook where job performance was measured by taste survival rates, and how often your food started an accidental murder. Let's set the scene. You're standing in a smoky kitchen, sweating through your wool tunic as the fire roars like a dragon on bath salts. There's no ventilation, no refrigeration. The meat has been aging for days, by which we mean rotting quietly under a linen cloth, while flies have a family reunion on it. Your spices imported and hoarded like treasure, your tools blunt, your odds of food poisoning astronomical. Now multiply that pressure by 10 if you're cooking for nobility. Lords and ladies demanded elaborate feast 10-20. Even 30 courses served in a precise order, with animals sculpted to look like other animals. Want to impress your duke? Better turn that swan into a roast that looks like a hedgehog stuffed with eels and coated in gold leaf. Yes, actual gold. Forget nutrition. This was edible status, and while the presentation dazzled, the hygiene was medieval at best. Butchers hacked meat on wooden tables soaked in centuries of grease and bacteria. Cooks used the same knives for porkfish and that one squirrel someone accidentally ran over. No gloves, no soap, no thermometers, just vibes and hope. Let's talk ingredients. Salt was king. Everything was salted meat, fish, fruit, probably feelings, because it was the only way to preserve food before refrigeration. The result, dishes so salty they could dehydrate a camel. But hey, better salt than botulism, which was the uninvited guest at every medieval banquet. Cooks didn't just season their food, they fought a daily war against spoilage parasites and invisible death. And the flour, you might think, well, at least bread is safe. No, it was not. Flour was often bulked up with powdered chalk ground up bones, or got a lovely little fungus that grows on rye, and causes hallucinations, seizures and death. So yes, your morning toast might have been served with a side of demonic visions. Bon appétit. Even the water was risky. Wells were often contaminated by latrines, dead animals or medieval optimism. So most people drank ale, yes, even kids, which meant cooks didn't just prepare food. They brewed drinks, managed barrels, and tried to avoid exploding kegs or accidental alcohol poisoning. Forget a quiet dinner shift, this was culinary bomb disposal. And let's not forget the seasonal shortages. Winter came, good luck. You were boiling turnips and praying, no tomatoes not yet discovered, no potatoes not yet imported, no sugar too expensive. If you wanted something sweet, you used honey if the local bees hadn't died from cold rot or divine punishment. Variety wasn't just limited, it was legally restricted depending on your social class. Some ingredients were reserved for nobles. A peasant caught eating swan could be punished. With death. Yes, bird-based capital punishment. And if you think you had it rough cooking for nobles, imagine feeding the troops. Field cooks worked in mud rain and battlefield smoke boiling whatever could be found, roots, old meat, or sometimes enemies. Yes, there are scattered rumours of cannibal stew in desperate sieges. So if you're crying over a dry turkey, remember that someone once served Lord Maybe Pig to a starving army. Cooks also doubled as healers, using their herb knowledge to make tonics, poultices, and digestive brews that were basically herbal teas laced with regret. Got stomach cramps? Here's a soup made of chamomile nettles and crushed snail shells. Or how about a broth with dried boar gall, mouldy bread, and a whisper of thyme? That's not medicine, it's a hazing ritual. And the blame. Oh, it always came back to the cook. If a noble got sick, it didn't matter that his meat was already green when he demanded it served rare. It was your fault. You could be beaten, banished, or beheaded for culinary crimes real or imagined. The phrase "too many cooks spoil the broth" didn't apply here. Just one cook could spoil an entire dynasty. Let's not forget the politics. Kitchens were hotbeds of gossip, scheming, and occasionally literal poisoning. Yes, cooks were sometimes recruited willingly, or not to slip something extra into the Duke's pheasant pie. Poisoning wasn't just a hobby, it was a career move. And if your employer got suspicious, you might be forced to taste every dish first. Imagine being both chef and test subject for your own deadly experiment. And then there's the sheer physical labour. Hauling firewood, turning spits, lifting iron cauldrons filled with gruel. Kitchens weren't ergonomic. Cooks worked in smoke-filled rooms with open flames on uneven floors, often barefoot. Burn scars were a badge of honour, or just proof you didn't duck fast enough when the grease exploded. Some cooks, however, became legends, royal chefs, Masters of feasts, the Gordon Ramsays of their day, minus the TV deals and plus the syphilis. These men could command respect, earn high wages, and occasionally escape the kitchen to become advisors. But for every one of them, there were 100 nameless kitchen drudges who died unknown, unloved, and probably mid-stir. Women, too, filled these roles, especially in taverns, monasteries, and manors. They worked harder, got paid less, and were more likely to be accused of witchcraft if the soup didn't taste right. Because obviously, if a woman made stew that cured a cold, it couldn't be her skill, it had to be Satan's recipe book. Now compare this to modern chefs. You have ovens with timers, thermometers that beep, health inspectors, running water, refrigeration. When your meat goes bad, you throw it out. When their meat went bad, they added more garlic and prayed it didn't walk away. Your risotto sticks, they died for that texture. And yet medieval cooks were innovators. They created entire cuisines out of scraps. They invented preservation techniques, developed sauces to hide rancid flavors, and learned how to survive a world where expiration date was just a whispered threat. They fed armies, kept cities alive, and wrote the earliest cookbooks, sometimes in rhymes, because apparently deadly food tastes better in verse. So next time you complain about cooking dinner after work, picture a sweating, soot-covered cook, hauling a pot of sheep brains across a rat-infested kitchen, while the Lord's son screams that his squirrel pie is too crunchy. Think of the spices bought with blood, the bread laced with fungus, the beef stuffed with pebbles to make it look heftier. Then go microwave your leftovers and whisper, "Thank you, ancient kitchen gremlins." Coming up next, grave robbers, because who said you can't make money after death? Especially if someone else is doing the dying. If your current side hustle involves selling handmade candles online, congratulations, you're already morally superior to the medieval grave robber. Because back in the day, some folks made their living not by crafting coding or cleaning, but by digging up corpses in the dead of night and selling whatever they found. Clothes gone, teeth harvested, jewellery pocketed. A body was just the starting inventory. It wasn't robbing the dead, it was recycling with a shovel and zero ethics. Let's start with the basics. Grave robbing wasn't just a crime, it was a popular one. Why? Because dead people had stuff. Medieval folks often buried their loved ones with rings, coins, belts, or even full outfits depending on their status. And to the impoverished underclass that was basically a treasure chest covered in dirt. You didn't need a treasure map, you just needed poor morals and a strong stomach. Nightfall was go time. Grave robbers worked under cover of darkness, moving quietly through graveyards with lanterns, tools, and breath held tight. The goal was speed, dig fast, loot faster, get out before anyone noticed the disturbed soil, or caught a glimpse of your suspicious lantern glow. Every moment spent in the ground meant a higher chance of getting caught, or worse, getting haunted, because medieval people were very into ghost-based justice. And they weren't just taking jewellery. Clothes were valuable, especially if they were wool or linen, anything but the peasant rags. Even shoes were looted. You'd think the smell of a decomposing foot would deter someone. Nope, it was just part of the job. Some grave robbers even specialised in tooth collecting, because human teeth could be resold to barber surgeons for use in dental prosthetics. So yes, your great-great-great-grandfather's molars might have ended up in some nobleman's grin. Sometimes the body itself was the goal. Enter the medical market, or what passed for it. Universities and barber surgeons needed cadavers to study anatomy, but dissecting bodies was controversial and heavily restricted. Solution: hire someone morally flexible with a shovel. Grave robbers would drag corpses, fresh ones, ideally back to the school or clinic for payment. It wasn't technically murder, just posthumous redistribution. But not all bodies were equal. The best corpses were those recently buried, preferably unguarded and from wealthier graves. Paupers were too decomposed and nobles were too well protected with mausoleums, stone slabs, or even iron cages called mort safes to keep sticky fingers away. Yes, people actually had to invent corpse cages because the dead weren't safe from capitalism. There were also body snatchers who worked for executioners or hospitals directly, especially when plague death surged. During outbreaks, graveyards overflowed and bodies were buried hastily. Chaos meant opportunity. Some robbers dug up plague victims for their clothes, knowing full well those rags could be contagious. But when your kids are starving, a lice-infested tunic still looks like gold. Let's not pretend it was easy. Grave robbing was dangerous, not just legally but physically. First you had to dig a grave by hand, often in frozen soil with crude tools, while listening for patrols, dogs or angry mourners. Second, corpses weren't always cooperative. Rigor mortis bloating and unexpected gas bursts made the job messy. Imagine prying a ring off a swollen finger and having the entire hand detach. Good times. Then there was the legal risk. Grave robbing was considered sacrilegious, criminal and downright demonic. If caught, punishments ranged from fines and public whipping to mutilation or execution depending on the region and the mood of the judge. Some robbers were forced to kiss the corpse they violated as a sort of macabre, poetic punishment. Others were simply hanged and buried in unmarked graves, an ironic full circle. But the money tempting. A single ring could feed your family for weeks. A set of fine clothes could be sold to merchants or passed off as inherited. And a fresh cadaver universities and surgeons paid top coin, no questions asked. A good night's work could earn more than a month's honest labour, and with fewer blisters, assuming you weren't emotionally scarred for life. And no, they weren't always loners. Grave robbing was often a team effort. You had diggers, lookouts and negotiators who haggled over corpse prices like it was a farmer's market. In some cities, underground networks handled distribution, laundering and body transport. It was a literal death economy, morally dead, economically thriving. Let's zoom out for a second. Why did society tolerate this? Because the line between morality and necessity was muddy, especially when everyone was broke. Rich folks condemned the practice until they needed a new set of teeth. Doctors preached ethics until they needed a body to practice surgery. Even churches turned a blind eye unless someone robbed their bishop, in which case hellfire was enthusiastically promised. The real fear, spiritual consequences. Medieval people believed the soul couldn't rest if the body was disturbed. A grave robbery wasn't just theft, it was a spiritual mugging. It condemned the deceased to wander the earth angry and unfinished. Ghost stories boomed. Robbers were said to be cursed, stalked by spectral hands, or haunted by whispering skulls. Whether true or not, it made for a good cautionary tale, especially for children who asked too many questions, and yet people kept doing it. Because death was everywhere and dignity was expensive. When a society worships relics but lets its poor rot in ditches, someone's going to start seeing dollar signs in the cemetery. Grave robbing became the ultimate middle finger to a class system that fed on bodies even in death. And yes, women were involved, sometimes as lookouts, sometimes as cleaners laundering stolen clothes, other times as the diggers themselves, especially during famine or war. These weren't cartoon villains. They were desperate people in desperate times doing the one job no one would admit needed doing. Fast forward to today, we still have black markets for human remains. We still have stolen grave goods, body trafficking, and a hunger for morbid curiosity. But now we call it true crime and package it with podcasts. Medieval grave robbers didn't get Spotify deals. They got cold, muddy, and sometimes stabbed by rival corpse thieves. So next time you stroll through a peaceful graveyard, admire the mossy stones and chirping birds, and then remember the people who once tiptoed through at midnight, hoping to pry gold teeth from the dearly departed before dawn. They weren't heroes. They weren't monsters. They were just broke, bloodied entrepreneurs with a lantern, a shovel, and a morally flexible business plan. Coming up next, scribes, because nothing says back pain and blindness like copying Latin for 12 hours straight in a candlelit closet. You think your office job is mind-numbing? Try spending 12 hours a day hunched over a desk in a candlelit stone cell, carefully copying the same Latin sentence for the 100th time, while a monk breathes down your neck for smudging a comma. Welcome to the life of a medieval scribe, where the ink was toxic, the posture was medieval yoga, and your greatest career goal was not going completely blind before finishing Leviticus. Let's start with the setting. You didn't work in an open, breezy co-working space with free coffee and ergonomic chairs. No scribes toiled in scriptoria, small, cold, dimly lit rooms inside monasteries, castles, or makeshift libraries that smelled like old parchment wax and regret. Your desk, a splintered wooden plank, your lighting, one flickering candle, your back support, faith. Scribes were the copy machines of the Middle Ages, except less efficient and significantly more flammable. Before the printing press revolutionized book production, every document, legal, religious, scientific, or poetic, had to be copied by hand. Word for word, letter by letter, no Ctrl+C, no Grammarly. If you misspelled a saint's name or drew a fish instead of a dove, congratulations, you've just committed heresy by doodle. And it wasn't just about accuracy, it was about beauty. Scribes weren't just expected to copy, they were expected to make every page a work of art. Perfect lines, consistent margins, illuminated letters with gold leaf, and delicate flourishes that screamed, "This Bible costs more than your entire village." You were expected to draw like Michelangelo, write like Cicero, and do it all while sitting on what was basically a medieval milking stool. Let's talk tools. You used a quill sharpened from a goose feather dipped in homemade ink made of oak galls, rust, and wine. This stuff was so acidic it could eat through the parchment if not used carefully. And the parchment animal skin, usually calf, goat, or sheep, painstakingly scraped and stretched until it was thin enough to write on, and thick enough to survive 1,000 years of human oily fingers. But ink and skin weren't the worst part, it was the repetition. Imagine copying psalms day after day, year after year. You start seeing the words in your dreams. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," becomes less of a verse and more of a personal diary entry. Mistakes meant rewriting entire sections. One dropped blob of ink and suddenly you're starting Genesis again. From scratch. Some scribes went mad. Literally. They developed trembling hands, went cross-eyed, or started talking to the saints in the margins. Others invented new curse words specifically for parchment that tore mid-page. There are surviving manuscripts where scribes wrote passive-aggressive notes at the end like, "Thank God this is over. The parchment is hairy, the quill is dull, my back is broken." Or the classic, "Whoever reads this, remember me." They were basically the world's first burned-out bloggers. And yes, scribes were mostly men, monks to be exact. They worked under religious orders, which meant silence, obedience, and exactly zero fun. But there were also female scribes, especially in convents. These women copied religious texts, local histories, and even medical guides. They didn't get much credit, but they left behind elegant handwriting and the occasional accidental feminist flourish in the margins. What makes the job truly dangerous, though, was exposure. Candle smoke in unventilated rooms, lung disease, toxic ink ingredients, neurological damage, sitting hunched for decades, permanent spinal curvature. Medieval scribes didn't retire. They curled into themselves like sad origami and eventually died at their desks. Their legacy, a beautifully written gospel and a hunchback. And let's not ignore the politics. Scribes were often caught between powerful forces, church, crown, and commerce. One day you're copying scripture. The next, you're transcribing a royal land grant that steals a village from peasants who now want to strangle you with your own scroll. Objectivity wasn't an option. You wrote what you were told, or you found out what happens to disobedient scribes when the ink dries. Also, mistakes mattered. A simple miswritten date could lead to a land dispute. A missing knot could flip a theological doctrine. Copy the wrong death year of a saint. Suddenly you've triggered an entire regional pilgrimage schedule crisis. The pressure was immense. You weren't just copying words, you were anchoring society's memory. One blot too many and you weren't just incompetent, you were blasphemous. Did scribes have lives outside their work? Barely. Most were cloistered, working 6 days a week, often fasting, sometimes illiterate in their own language, but fluent in Latin they didn't even speak aloud. Social interaction limited. Joy tightly regulated. Their best hope was to be remembered as diligent, a medieval word for didn't complain too loudly while dying upright. And yet there were moments of rebellion, hidden jokes and doodles in the margins. Monks drew snail knights, farting dragons, and cats licking their butts. Why? Because when you spend your life copying sacred texts in silence, sometimes you just need to draw a butt-licking cat. It was the only creative freedom they had, and honestly, we should thank them. Without their secret sass, medieval manuscripts would be beautiful and boring. Some scribes became legends. The scribes of Lindisfarne, the makers of the Book of Kells, those who wrote the Magna Carta or the Domesday Book. Their handwriting changed history, but most anonymous. Their names lost, their work unsigned. They were ghosts in ink, preserving knowledge for a future that wouldn't know their faces but still reads their words. Compare that to, now typing is instant spell check, is automatic, and nobody goes blind writing tweets. We toss off messages, delete them, rephrase them, and hit send with the ease of a sneeze. But scribes. Every letter was a commitment. Every mistake a permanent scar. Every completed page a victory over time, fatigue, and creeping arthritis. So the next time you draft an email and whine that your wrists hurt, remember the man or woman who dipped a feather into acid ink 1,000 years ago to copy a book they weren't allowed to question, under threat of eternal damnation, in a room lit by fire and misery, and all that, just so you could Google cool medieval jobs centuries later. Coming up next, gong farmers had it bad, but wait till you meet the lime burners, people who got paid to stand next to explosive powder and corrosive death. If you've ever complained about a dusty workplace, try inhaling powdered death for a living. Welcome to the thrilling world of medieval lime burners. The people who took perfectly innocent limestone, heated it until it screamed, and turned it into a caustic powder that could build castles, clean corpses, or melt your face off. It was a job that came with high pay, high heat, and a high chance you'd die before your 40th birthday. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, getting paid to breathe was fine, as long as what you were breathing wasn't air. Let's start with the basics. Lime burners weren't making margaritas, they were making quicklime. That's calcium oxide for the chemistry nerds. You got it by shoving chunks of limestone into a kiln, setting it on fire for days, and then extracting the bone-white powder that emerged like the ashes of regret. That powder was gold to builders. It made mortar for stone walls, plaster for fancy ceilings, and whitewash for churches that wanted to look holy while slowly poisoning everyone inside. But quicklime didn't like being handled. It hissed when it got wet, releasing intense heat enough to boil water and cook flesh. Touch it with bare skin, and you got chemical burns. Inhale it, and your lungs begged for mercy. It didn't smell. It just killed you quietly. The worst part, it looked like flour. Imagine reaching into what you think is a bag of baking powder, only to realize you've just given yourself a respiratory sandblasting. The lime kilns themselves were medieval nightmares. Massive stone furnaces dug into hillsides, roaring day and night, fed with wood coal, or anything flammable, sometimes even garbage. You had to keep the heat constant, often for 3 to 5 days straight. That meant sleeping in shifts, tending the fire even during storms, and hoping the kiln didn't explode from gas buildup, which it did. Often, lime kilns were basically slow-cooking bombs. And it wasn't just heat, it was suffocating heat. The kind that peels your skin and scorches your eyes. The ground around the kiln was covered in soot dust and dead silence. Birds avoided it. So did most villagers, unless they wanted to offer a prayer or a stiff drink to the lunatic working the fire. Lime burners looked like ghosts before they were dead, ashen skin, red eyes, coughing like condemned men. And still they showed up for work. Why? Because the job paid well. Building projects were booming cathedrals, castles, walls, even peasant homes, and they all needed mortar. Lime was also used to treat waste and even bury plague victims, since it helped speed decomposition and kill germs, or so people thought. So every town needed lime and someone had to make it. You got paid more than a stable boy, sometimes even more than a blacksmith. But the catch was you might only last 5 years doing it. Let's talk about the dust. Lime dust got everywhere, on your clothes, in your hair, under your nails, and deep into your lungs. Musks. No. Wet cloth over your mouth, maybe. But good luck keeping that damp while standing next to a medieval kiln. With every breath you were shaving minutes off your life. Lungs turned to chalkboards. Some lime burners coughed so much they dislocated ribs. Others simply dropped dead mid-shift, their bodies already halfway preserved by the very dust they burned. And accidents. Oh, so many. Trip while loading the kiln. Fall in. That's not metaphorical. You would literally fall into fire. The walls were hot, the stones slippery, and visibility was trash. Lime could also ignite nearby materials when it got wet. There are records of entire barns catching fire because someone stored quicklime too close to a leaky roof. Because when water hits quicklime, it boils. And when it boils, it splashes on everything, including you. But perhaps the worst part was the loneliness. Lime burners were feared, shunned, and often forced to live on the edge of town. Not because they were rude, but because they were basically walking contamination. People believed the dust clung to them like a curse. And honestly, it kind of did. Clothes dissolved, hair fell out, skin blistered. You couldn't go to market without being followed by coughing and whispers. Still, someone had to do it. And in many cases, lime burning was a family affair. Fathers taught sons. Wives helped haul stone. Children played dangerously close to kilns because there was nowhere else to go. Inheritance meant a legacy of lung disease. It wasn't just a job, it was a death sentence passed down like an heirloom. And women. Yes, there were female lime burners, especially in areas hit hard by war or plague where men had died or fled. These women didn't just haul rocks, they ran the entire operation. Tough, sunburned and blackened by dust, they managed kilns, negotiated prices and buried husbands without ever leaving the worksite. They were respected, but from a distance, like a thunderstorm or an angry goose. Despite all this, lime burners were vital to society. Without them, there'd be no cathedrals, no bridges, no public toilets that didn't overflow onto the street. They laid the literal foundation for the medieval world, and paid for it with scorched lungs, melted skin, and a social life that consisted of nodding at the occasional rat. Compare that to today. Quicklime is still used in construction and industry, but with modern equipment, respirators, gloves, regulations. Workers have eye-washing stations, fire extinguishers, medical insurance. Lime dust is handled like the dangerous chemical it is. Back then it was just white powder you must never anger, and yet we don't remember lime burners. There are no statues, no holidays, no candlelit vigils. Their names weren't recorded. Their deaths weren't mourned. but the stones of every surviving medieval castle, church or city wall contain a little bit of their work and probably a little bit of their actual ashes, because safety wasn't exactly high on the checklist. So next time you walk past a stone wall and admire its age, remember the person who roasted limestone until it turned to powder, breathed that powder for years and probably died, coughing next to a fire they never escaped. They weren't saints or soldiers. They were just poor workers whose job description was breathe rocks until you drop. Coming up next, Spit Boys, because nothing says career goals like standing next to a fire for 16 hours turning a pig on a stick. If you've ever whined about unpaid internships, allow me to introduce the Spit Boy, the medieval child employee, whose entire job was to rotate meat over an open flame until his arms went numb, his eyebrows sizzled off, and his soul gently toasted. Forget minimum wage. This was minimum existence in a kitchen so hot it could cook your future along with the pork. Welcome to the bottom rung of medieval culinary hell, where you didn't just roast dinner, you roasted with it. Spit boys or turn brochures were often young boys, sometimes orphans, sometimes servants, sometimes just the unlucky youngest child. Their job: sit or stand near the fire and keep the roasting spit spinning at just the right speed. Too slow, the meat burns on one side. Too fast, it's raw in the middle. You had one job and it was agonizingly specific, endlessly repetitive, and performed in an environment that made volcanoes feel breezy. Let's talk fire. Open hearths in great kitchens weren't cute fireplaces, they were blazing infernos fueled by wood charcoal and the collective rage of every screaming chef in a 10-mile radius. There were no fans, no ventilation, just smoke sweat and the smell of slowly rotating goose flesh. Temperatures could hit over 50 degree or 220 degree and right where the Spit Boy sat. That's not cooking. That's medieval tanning meat edition. And the position, oh, it was prime. You weren't front and centre with a view. No, you were often in a cramped smoky alcove beside the fire, with ash falling in your hair and fat spattering your face. Many kitchens had special enclosures called turnspit wheels, where boys literally ran like hamsters to keep the meat turning via a pulley system. Yes, medieval kitchens invented the meat-powered treadmill, because why not? The workday wasn't 8 hours. It was until the feast was done. That could mean sunrise to midnight, especially in noble houses with elaborate meals spanning multiple animals and a dozen courses. You didn't eat first. You didn't sit down. You turned. You sweated. You listened to meat sizzle louder than your will to live. Some boys were too tired to even cry. Others cried into the fire and watched the tears sizzle. Burns. Of course. Blisters standard. Permanent scars. Basically the uniform. You didn't need training. You needed heat resistance, a steady hand, and the mental fortitude to watch your own skin blister while keeping a duck evenly browned. Spit Boys didn't just cook. They sacrificed. And when the food was finally served, they didn't get any. Leftovers, maybe. If the dog didn't get there first. Now imagine doing this job during summer, with the added bonus of flies rot and spoiled meat that needed to be masked with extra spices or sugar to hide the flavour of impending death. The boy who turned that pig didn't just sweat, he fumed. From heat, from exhaustion, from knowing that if he stopped spinning, someone with more status and less compassion would make sure he never spun again. Some Spit Boys graduated to better roles, kitchen helpers, knife boys, maybe even cooks. But many just burned out literally and figuratively. Chronic dehydration, respiratory issues from constant smoke inhalation, malnutrition. There are records of boys collapsing mid-spin, falling into the hearth, or being beaten for ruining a nobleman's venison with an uneven roast. The problem wasn't the system. The problem was you dared to blink. And yes, this job was mostly done by boys. But in smaller homes or inns, girls took the role too, especially if there weren't enough male servants, or if the family was desperate. Gender didn't matter when the fire needed feeding. Only whether you could hold the spit steady long enough to survive until supper. There was no protective gear, no gloves, no aprons thick enough to block the flames. Just linen shirts soaked in sweat and sometimes lard, which made you flammable if things went very wrong. Some kitchens put up metal shields to deflect the heat, but guess who didn't get access to those? The child turning the pig. Too expensive. Better to let the child roast a little than lose your goose to undercooking. Now you might be wondering, why didn't they automate the process? They did eventually. Dogs were sometimes trained to run in wheels instead of boys. Yes, they replaced children with canines who, to be fair, probably enjoyed the job more. Later came clockwork devices and mechanical turn spits. But for centuries, meat rotation was powered by children's elbows and sheer medieval apathy. And the smells. Good Lord, the smells. Sweet dripping fat mixed with scorched wood, singed hair, and the occasional rat roasting under the hearth. You didn't walk away hungry, you walked away nauseated. Your skin smelled like bacon. Your clothes smelled like regret. And your soul smelled like someone else's dinner. Yet despite all this, spit boys were essential. No feast could happen without them. Nobles might toast kings and wage wars, but none of it mattered if the roast came out wrong. In the background there was always a child sweating behind the flame, spinning some duck to perfection while praying he wouldn't collapse face first into a pile of embers. Were they respected? Not really. They were part of the kitchen's living machinery used, ignored, occasionally beaten, and always replaceable. If one died, there was another poor soul ready to sweat in his place. The meat had to turn, the fire had to burn, the boy had to learn. Today we rotate food with the push of a button. Microwaves spin, burritos ovens have rotisserie settings, and no child loses an eyebrow while making dinner. But the spit boys, they were the original slow cookers, flesh and bone sacrifices on the altar of culinary vanity. Every perfectly roasted medieval feast was built on a foundation of scorched fingers and dashed childhoods. So the next time your rotisserie chicken comes out of the grocery store golden and tender, maybe whisper a small thank you to the kid who once turned a goose for 16 hours straight, without so much as a break to pee. Because his burnt knuckles kept your ancestors fed and kept some noblemen from throwing a tantrum about crust consistency. Coming up next, bell founders, because nothing rings in hearing loss, and molten metal burns like casting 2,000-pound instruments of noise in your backyard. If you thought your last DIY project was intense, try building a 2,000-pound death gong out of molten bronze in a medieval backyard with no OSHA, no thermometers, and no margin for error. Welcome to the excruciating art of bell founding, where your job was to craft beautiful instruments of divine sound using techniques that could, and often did, explode in your face. Because nothing brings you closer to God like being vaporized by boiling metal next to a cathedral. Bells were serious business in medieval society. They rang in births, deaths, weddings, plagues, fires, and war. Every town wanted one. The bigger, louder, and more majestic the bell, the more holy the town seemed, and the more deaf the bell founder became. These weren't cowbells or dainty wind chimes. They were industrial-sized thunderbolts forged by maniacs with tongs and a dream. Let's talk ingredients. A bell wasn't just metal, it was science alchemy, and a little bit of medieval gambling. The typical bell was made from bronze, roughly 78% copper, 22% tin. But here's the catch. Both metals had to be clean balanced and heated to over 1,000 degrees Cent. 1/800 degree. That's lava temperature. Except you're not in a volcano, you're in a shed with wooden scaffolding and a prayer to St. Agatha, patron saint of molten death. The furnace. A nightmare cauldron fueled by charcoal or wood, pumped by bellows until the metal reached a rolling, glowing boil. It had to be poured perfectly, one wrong move, and the entire casting was ruined. Or worse, cracked. A cracked bell was useless. It rang flat like a dying toad, and that meant the founder would either fix it or face social exile. Or actual exile. Some towns banished bell founders who botched the town's holy sound. Then came the mould, the sacred womb in which the bell would be born. Creating it was a mix of engineering and voodoo. Layers of brick, wax, loam and horse dung were shaped into the perfect cavity, sometimes carved with inscriptions, religious imagery, or the founder's initials if they were feeling cocky. The mould had to be buried underground to contain the pour. Why? Because if the mould cracked under heat, molten bronze would burst through like Satan's soup and incinerate anything within 15 feet. Now imagine lifting several 100 pounds of boiling metal into a narrow mould in near total silence, because any distraction could mean disaster. No hard hats, no fireproof gloves, no safety railings, just scorched eyebrows, blistered hands, and the occasional scream when someone lost track of which side of the crucible was hot, spoiler all of it. And the timing excruciating. Pour too soon, and the metal doesn't fuse properly. Pour too late and it starts to cool mid-pour, resulting in bubbles, cracks, or what bell founders politely called a cursed lump of shame. And you couldn't just melt it again. Once it cooled badly, the shape was wrong forever. You'd either destroy the mould and start over or find a monastery that appreciated lopsided acoustics. But if the pour went well, you didn't celebrate. You waited, sometimes weeks. The mould had to cool naturally without sudden temperature shifts. If the weather changed, the bell cracked. If someone bumped it, the bell cracked. If a butterfly sneezed near it, cracked. Bell founders developed the emotional range of nervous squirrels. They didn't drink until the bell rang not just once, but correctly. And then came the tuning. You couldn't just slap a rope on it and call it music. Bells had to be shaved, chiseled, and sanded to exact acoustic perfection by hand, with files, over days. Tuning a bell wasn't an art. It was a mental breakdown carved in bronze. Get it right and angels sang. Get it wrong and the town priest quietly removed your name from the donor plaque. Of course, not all towns were patient or polite. Some paid bell founders only after the bell was rung publicly. And if the sound disappointed, you might be pelted with spoiled vegetables or accused of sabotaging God's voice. In one infamous case, a bell that rang slightly off-key was blamed for a hailstorm. The founder had to flee, not because of science, but because someone said the devil sings through crooked bells. Oh, and did we mention death by fume-melting metal releases all kinds of invisible horrors, lead vapor, arsenic, tin fumes. Breathing near a casting pit for a few years basically guaranteed you'd develop lung rot or metal poisoning. Many founders coughed until they bled. Others lost their teeth, their balance, or their memories. Still they kept pouring, because bells were immortal. Bell founders, not so much. And yet, they were respected, revered even. Good founders were in high demand, travelling across Europe building legacies that literally echoed for centuries. Some inscribed their names in every bell. Others left little marked secret jokes or prayers. They knew they might die young, but the bell would keep ringing long after their bones turned to dust. Women were rarely allowed to cast bells, but they assisted especially in family workshops. They helped mould mixed materials, manage fires. In desperate times, like during war or plague, they stepped in completely. But if the bell rang wrong, guess who was blamed? Not the dead father, not the inexperienced apprentice, the woman, because clearly she'd bewitched the bronze. Logic. Compare that to today's metal casting. Foundries have clean rooms, ventilation machines that measure temperature to the decimal. Bells are tuned with computers. Accidents are rare. Lawsuits exist. But back then, you were one stray ember away from becoming a footnote in acoustics history. Trial by fire was not a metaphor, it was the morning shift. And yet, we owe them so much. Those bells marked time, called people to prayer, warned of danger, celebrated peace. They were the original broadcast systems, and they still ring in cities today. That sound. It's not just music. It's the echo of a man who stared into molten death and whispered, "Let it pour." So the next time you hear a church bell toll stop, really listen. Somewhere deep in that chime is the ghost of a barefoot bell founder grinning through soot-covered teeth, grateful his final pour didn't end in flames and failure. And if the note sounds a little off, don't blame him. He probably inhaled a pound of arsenic just to make it happen. Coming up next, Sin Eaters. Because when your job is to eat food off corpses to absorb their sins, things get spiritually and gastronomically messy. If you've ever taken the blame for something you didn't do, congratulations, you're emotionally qualified to be a sin eater. But in medieval Europe, this wasn't just a metaphor. It was a job, a real actual profession where people were paid a few coins and a crust of bread to sit next to a corpse, eat a meal placed on the chest and absorb all their sins through their digestive system. Think of it as spiritual DoorDash, except your delivery came with rigor mortis and eternal damnation. The theory was simple, the execution. Not so much. According to folk belief, when someone died, their unconfessed sins didn't just float away, they hung around like spiritual body odour clinging to the corpse. The solution: put bread or a pie or a hunk of meat on the dead person's chest. Hire a sin eater and have them eat it. Voila. The sins were transferred from the body into the eater's gut, because apparently the soul is just a really vengeful sandwich. Sin eaters weren't priests. They weren't holy. In fact, they were usually the opposite outcast beggars or mentally ill villagers who lived alone in the woods and talked to squirrels. They were called in at the last minute right before burial. Not welcomed, not thanked, just summoned like a magical sponge for damnation. You know you've hit rock bottom when your career path has become spiritually contaminated in exchange for someone else's stale dinner roll. And the ritual. It was grim. The body was laid out, food placed on the chest, usually bread, cheese ale or meat, and sometimes even passed over the face to soak up the last lingering sins like a holy lint roller. The sin eater would kneel, mutter a few vague words, scarf it down and then walk out in silence. No applause, no hugs, just the lingering taste of guilt onions and whatever the dead guy had been hiding. The payment minimal, a few coins, maybe a loaf of bread for later, sometimes a drink. But no one touched them, thanked them or made eye contact. Because now that person carried sins not symbolically but literally according to the locals. They were walking spiritual trash bins, human landfills for guilt, and you definitely didn't want to sit next to them at church. And yet they were needed, especially in remote areas where priests were scarce or where the dead had been, let's say, less than holy. Died in a brawl, sin eater. Adulterer, sin eater. Got struck by lightning while stealing grain, double sin eater, with extra cheese. These people were society's moral janitors, scrubbing away what the clergy either missed or politely ignored. But the price wasn't just social, it was spiritual paranoia. Many sin eaters believed the sins actually stayed inside them. Some said they felt sick after eating. Others heard voices. Some claimed they aged faster, saw ghosts, or couldn't sleep without nightmares. Was it guilt? Was it psychological? Or just the natural side effect of eating meat that had been marinating on a corpse for 8 hours? Hard to say. And remember, this wasn't sanitary. There were no gloves, no refrigeration. Sometimes the dead had been sitting there for days. You weren't just eating sin, you were eating decay. Bread soaked in death sweat. Ale warmed by corpse heat. This wasn't a sacrament. It was food poisoning with a side of cosmic horror. Of course the church hated this. Official doctrine said only confession and sacraments could absolve sin. So sin eating was labelled as heresy, paganism, or rural stupidity, sometimes all three. But the people kept doing it. because it worked. Not spiritually perhaps, but emotionally. It gave closure. The family believed their loved one was clean and the sin eater got fed. It was disgusting, sacrilegious, and incredibly practical. And it wasn't just men. In some regions, women took up the role, especially widows' healers, or those already seen as strange. They were feared even more. A woman who ate sins and also brewed herbal tea's witch alert. The local priest might tolerate a drunken male sin-eater with one eye and 3 teeth, but a woman who looked calm and competent clearly in league with Satan. Sin-eaters were often blamed for misfortune. Crops fail, must be the guy full of sins walking around like a cursed meat sack. Livestock die mysteriously. Has to be the woman who eats bread off dead faces. One English village even tried to drown its sin-eater during a drought. Their logic, he's hoarding sins and sins block rain. Medieval meteorology at its finest. But some sin-eaters leaned in. They wore dark clothing, painted their faces, refused to speak outside ceremonies. They became living myths, feared, hated, but impossible to ignore. Some were hired by multiple villages. Some kept ledgers of whose sins they'd eaten. One man in Wales claimed he had digested more vice than the bishop himself. Probably true, definitely gross. There was also a dark irony. Sin-eaters were paid to take away guilt, but they themselves died unforgiven. No priest would give them last rites. No one ate food off their chests. They were buried in unmarked graves outside consecrated ground, as if their lifetime of eating sins made them too bloated for heaven. Which, to be fair, sounds about right. And yet, people mourned them. Quietly. Secretly. There are folk songs, carvings, and whispered legends about sin-eaters who saved souls, prevented hauntings, or took on the burden of entire villages. They weren't saints. They were never clean. But they were necessary, especially in a world where spiritual fear was stronger than reason, and closure came with bread crust and superstition. Today, sin-eating is gone, replaced by therapist confession apps, and that one friend who always listens to your problems and then needs 2 days to recover. But the urge remains, the desire to dump guilt onto someone else, to pay someone, anyone, to make the bad feelings go away. The modern sin-eater might be your barista, your bartender, your algorithm. Just don't feed them bread soaked in corpse sweat. So next time you feel guilty, spare a thought for the lonely figure at the edge of a funeral wiping his mouth after eating death's last supper. He didn't get a eulogy. He didn't get a clean soul. But he made sure your uncle could enter heaven without explaining that incident with the chickens in 1312. Coming up next, tooth pullers, because dental hygiene didn't exist, but pain definitely did, and someone had to yank out the screaming. Think your dentist appointment was rough. Did it include a screaming mob, rusty pliers, and a man in a feathered hat pulling your molars while juggling? No. Then congratulations, you've officially had a better dental experience than most people in the Middle Ages. Welcome to the medieval world of tooth pullers, where dentistry was less science and more street performance with blood. Let's be clear, dentistry as a medical profession didn't really exist in the medieval period. There were barber surgeons, sure, who did a little of everything: amputations, bloodletting, haircut on Tuesdays. But if your teeth were rotting, blackened, or buzzing like a swarm of angry bees, you didn't go to a clinic. You went to the local fair where a man with questionable hygiene and very questionable tools promised to fix your mouth for a small fee and a large amount of pain. These wandering tooth pullers set up in markets, festivals, or town squares. They were part doctor, part showman, part con artist. Their stalls were decked out with colourful banners, loud music, and sometimes actual displays of extracted teeth like trophies. Picture it: a crowd gathers, the tooth puller cracks jokes, points at a poor soul holding their jaw in agony, and then yanks a molar out while shouting, "Behold, the curse is lifted, cue applause." Cue fainting. No anaesthesia, no antiseptic. Just raw nerve and rawer steel. Their tool of choice was the dental pelican, or the tooth key, both of which look like torture devices designed by someone who hated joy. The pelican worked by clamping onto the tooth and then levering it out sideways, often cracking neighbouring teeth in the process. The key hooked around the tooth, then twisted it free with a glorious snap that could be heard 2 streets away. Medieval ASMR, the pain legendary. People screamed. Some passed out. Others had to be restrained by friends or paid assistance while the tooth puller grunted and wrestled with their mouth like it was a bear trap. In many cases, the wrong tooth was pulled. In other cases, multiple teeth came out at once accidentally, 1 yank 3 teeth free with purchase, and the infection risk through the roof. Tools were rarely cleaned, hands weren't washed, cloths were reused. Some tooth pullers dipped their tools in wine or vinegar for sanitation, which helped a little but did nothing for the deeper bacterial buffet inside medieval gums. Many patients developed abscesses, blood poisoning, or simply died a few days later. But by then the tooth puller was long gone off to the next village trailing blood and reviews like he was cheap, but now I can't feel my face. But the business was booming. Why? Because tooth pain was everywhere. People had awful diets full of sugar if they were rich, full of grit if they were poor. Bread was made with ground-up stone from millstones, which eroded enamel faster than a modern cola addiction. By age 30, most people had mouths like haunted graveyards, rotting gums, exposed nerves, swollen jaws, and nothing relieved the pain like a good old-fashioned rip. Tooth pulling wasn't just medical, it was entertainment. At big festivals, pullers competed for crowds. Some wore outrageous costumes. Others offered miracle cures alongside their extractions, ointments, powders, enchanted herbs. One man in 14th century France claimed he could pull teeth without pain. He'd just scream louder than the patient so no one noticed. Another offered a free pie if he pulled 2 molars in under a minute. No word on what was in the pie, and the showmanship worked. Crowds cheered when the tooth finally came free, usually accompanied by a fountain of blood and a dramatic collapse. Children laughed, musicians played. A man just lost a bicuspid, but it was fun. Pain as public spectacle. Dentistry as trauma theatre. Some tooth pullers even travelled with musicians, bards or dancers to distract the patient while they operated. Of course, not all of them were clueless. A few actually knew what they were doing. They'd apprenticed with surgeons, understood basic anatomy, and used care even if the tools were crude. But most were just strong-armed opportunists with a knack for finding desperate people and twisting metal. And people paid them anyway, because pain doesn't wait for certification. Some even added fortune-telling or palm reading to their services. Ah, I see a rotten molar and a long journey ahead. Unless I remove it for 2 groats. Others used religious theatre, chanting prayers, invoking saints, or claiming to channel divine healing. Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dental sufferers, was particularly popular. Tooth pullers often had her icon displayed right next to a blood-stained rag, and a smile missing several teeth. And yes, women were involved. While rare female tooth pullers did exist, often serving as local healers, or midwives who expanded their services. They pulled teeth more quietly with less public show, and sometimes had better reputations for gentleness. Naturally, this meant they were accused of witchcraft, because if a woman pulled a tooth without pain, clearly she'd made a pact with the devil, or had basic empathy. Let's not forget the social pressure. If you refused treatment, your friends might call you a coward. Children were dragged in by the ear. Husbands forced wives. Wives dragged husbands. Getting your teeth yanked wasn't just a personal decision, it was communal suffering. He got his pulled, why not you, like peer pressure but with blood loss, after care. Don't make me laugh. There were no gauze pads, no painkillers. Some patients stuffed cloth in the wound. Others drank heavily and hoped for the best. Some took remedies made of boiled nettles, crushed frogs, or warm goat's milk. One popular option was to hold a dead mouse against the jaw, under the belief it would draw out tooth demons. Spoiler, it did not. But despite all this, despite the pain, the infections, the public humiliation, people still lined up. Because the alternative was worse. Living with constant toothache, fever and rot meant sleepless nights and slow death. Tooth pullers offered relief, however crude, and in a world without Novocaine or floss that was worth any price, even if it meant losing half your smile and your dignity in the process. Some pullers became local legends. They had names like One-Eyed Jacob or Sister Mercy and were remembered for their speed brutality or weirdly soothing humming. Others were feared, their arrival causing more groaning than cheering, but they kept working village to village, mouth to mouth, leaving behind a trail of empty sockets and grateful screams. Compare that to today: sterile rooms, reclining chairs, polite hygienists, local anesthesia. You get a lollipop afterward. In the Middle Ages you got an infection and a new fear of hats with feathers. But the core truth remains: dental pain makes people desperate, and they'll pay almost anything to make it stop. Even if it means trusting a man with a Carter cloak and a grin that looks like it's lost the battle with gingivitis. So next time you sit in a dentist's chair, numbed and mildly annoyed by the whir of a suction tube, think of your ancestors. The ones who clenched their fists looked up at a tooth puller in the marketplace and thought, well, I guess this is how I meet God, and thank your stars that your dentist doesn't shout "Behold" before yanking your molars out in front of a paying audience. Coming up next, resurrectionists, because stealing bodies wasn't just for money, it was for medicine, mischief, and the occasional necromantic side hustle. If your night job involves a shovel, a sack, and a corpse that doesn't belong to you, congratulations, you're either a horror movie villain or a resurrectionist. In the late medieval and early modern periods, these were the real-life boogeymen who dug up freshly buried bodies under moonlight and sold them to people in lab coats, or to people in no coats, depending on how fresh the merchandise was. Their resume read, grave robber logistics specialist part-time decomposer. And their job, simple. Find a corpse, steal it, don't get caught. Resurrectionists weren't looking for jewellery or coins that was old-school grave robbing. No, they were after the full human package. Bodies. Whole bodies. Preferably fresh. Preferably intact. Preferably with all limbs attached and none of the screaming relatives watching. Because in a time when cadavers were desperately needed for anatomical study, but the church frowned on slicing up grandma, someone had to supply the demand. Enter the morally flexible corpse courier. Let's talk business. Medical schools needed bodies to teach students how to cut without killing, stitch without butchering, and recognize the difference between a spleen and a sock. But legal cadavers were rare. Executed criminals were the primary source, but the justice system couldn't keep up with the syllabus. You can't exactly plan your curriculum around hangings. So professors and surgeons turned to the unofficial supply chain, a man with a cart, a bottle of gin and zero scruples. The method straightforward. You scout a burial, ideally a poor person buried shallowly in a wooden box. You wait for nightfall, then you dig fast, not the whole grave. Just enough to break into the coffin and yank the body out by the arms like removing an uncooperative baguette from a plastic bag. In, out, gone. All in under an hour if you were good. 30 minutes if you were desperate. 15 if you didn't mind parts instead of holes. Resurrectionists didn't steal clothing. It was illegal to steal the possessions of the dead, but oddly not always the dead themselves. So the corpse was stripped at the graveside, folded like laundry and stuffed into a sack, sometimes into barrels, sometimes into baskets. sometimes into wheelbarrows covered with turnips to look agricultural. Because nothing says plausible deniability like a twitching toe under your vegetables. And the tools of the trade, a lantern, a shovel, a bottle of liquor, and a strong stomach. The smell was horrific. The sound, wet, cracking, sloshing was worse. If you dug up a bloated body too soon, gases could burst. One unlucky snatcher was known to have taken a faceful of what witnesses called the sins of the intestines. No one spoke to him for weeks. Were they alone? Rarely. Resurrectionists worked in crews, 2 or 3 diggers, 1 lookout, and maybe a bribed undertaker or graveyard keeper. Some even had deals with coffin makers to deliberately build weak lids. Others paid the local watchman to take strategic bathroom breaks at 2 a.m. Corruption wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. Everyone had a price, except the corpse, which had a market value instead, and business was good. A fresh body could fetch 10 to 20 times what a labourer made in a week. Young, healthy bodies were in highest demand, particularly women whose anatomy was still considered medical mystery. Fetuses and babies even more valuable. The horror of it didn't slow the buyers down. Professors needed samples. Students needed practice. The resurrectionists just needed coin and a fast exit. Of course people caught on. Families hired guards. Cemeteries built morte-safes, iron cages over graves. Some buried their dead with exploding coffins or loaded pistols inside. One Scottish widow famously slept on her husband's grave for 2 weeks, with a shotgun across her lap, daring anyone to try. No one did. Love may be eternal, but grief with a firearm is very persuasive. Resurrectionists weren't welcome in polite society. They were loathed, feared, and occasionally lynched. Some were tarred and feathered. Others were forced to dig graves under supervision until their arms bled. A few were jailed, but mostly they slipped away. Changed names, moved towns, returned next week with a fake moustache and a new shovel. But here's the twist: some resurrectionists actually believed in what they were doing. They weren't just in it for the money. They thought medical science needed bodies, that their work, however foul, was necessary for progress. Some even left anonymous notes. Forgive me, but the doctors must learn. It wasn't morality, it was utility. Rot now to save lives later. Women again weren't absent. Some served as scouts, watching burials, noting locations, relaying info to male crews. Others helped prep corpses, clean up evidence, or distract nosy neighbours. One Irish woman was famous for carrying a dead baby in a bread basket to a Dublin hospital while singing lullabies to make it look alive. Genius, evil, both you decide. The ethical chaos eventually led to changes in law. By the 19th century, new acts allowed the use of unclaimed bodies from poorhouses and hospitals, decreasing the need for body snatching. But before then, it was a corpse free for all. Graveyards weren't resting places. They were inventory. And no, this wasn't just a problem in England or France. It happened across Europe and even early America. The term resurrectionist became so infamous that some churches refused to bury anyone on moonlit nights. You had to wait until the clouds came, because apparently moonlight helped grave robbers see better, and heaven forbid they have good visibility while stealing your aunt. Eventually the public pushed back. Riots erupted. One Edinburgh mob burned a medical school to the ground after rumours of stolen corpses. In other towns, people exhumed graves just to check. Many found nothing. That's how widespread it was. Whole neighbourhoods became skeletal donor banks without even realising it. And still, the resurrectionists kept digging. Because the money was good, the risk manageable, and the reward tangible. Especially compared to every other job we've covered, burned, beaten, buried in lime, or devoured by rats. At least resurrectionists worked at night, didn't deal with live patients, and got to choose their clients posthumously. Today the practice is gone, legally anyway. But the legacy lives on in medical textbooks, anatomy museums, and every overly realistic skeleton in a university lab. If your doctor knows where your liver is, thank a man who risked getting stabbed with a pitchfork in 1723 while dragging a corpse across a churchyard wall. So next time you walk through a cemetery, remember the dead might be at peace now. But once upon a time they were part of a very busy, very illegal side hustle that helped build modern science one stolen body at a time. If that doesn't make you want to clutch your bones a little tighter, nothing will. And with that, our tour of medieval jobs that could kill you comes to a dusty, bloody, slightly charred end. From rats to rotisserie to resurrection, we've seen it all. The danger, the filth, the desperation, the bizarre dignity, all packed into one unforgettable job fair from hell. Next time you complain about spreadsheets meetings or slow Wi-Fi pause, think about the boy spinning a pig on a spit, the woman standing in a swamp feeding leeches, the man digging up a priest at midnight to pay rent. And remember, history wasn't built by kings. It was built by people with terrible jobs and even worse insurance.